She was born inside the largest private home in America, an heiress to one of the richest dynasties in history. She had the money, the title, the future already written for her, and then she walked away. She divorced her aristocratic husband, abandoned her mansion, left her country, changed her name, dyed her hair pink, and refused to even return home for her own mother's funeral. Why would one of the wealthiest women in the world erase herself on purpose? Was she running from a loveless marriage? From the suffocating weight of the Vanderbilt name? Or from something far darker hidden inside the walls of Biltmore? Twice. Death missed her by inches. Once on the Titanic. Once in a Nazi air attack. Was it coincidence or destiny? This is the story of Cornelia Vanderbilt, the heiress who had everything and chose to disappear. On August 22, 1900, a child was born inside a mansion so vast it felt less like a home and more like a kingdom. Her name was Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt. She did not enter the world in a modest hospital room or a townhouse on a crowded street. She was born at Biltmore Estate, a 250-room chateau rising from the hills of North Carolina like a transplanted fragment of the French Renaissance. Even by Gilded Age standards, it was excessive by modern standards. It remains staggering. Cornelia did not just inherit wealth, she inherited a dynasty. Her great-grandfather was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the man who built a transportation empire from steamships and railroads in the 19th century. By the time he died in 1877, he had accumulated one of the largest private fortunes in American history. The Vanderbilt name was not merely respected. It was feared, envied, and studied. Cornelia's grandfather, William Henry Vanderbilt, expanded that fortune to an almost unimaginable scale. When he died in 1885, he left behind roughly $200 million, billions in today's money. Her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, inherited only a fraction compared to his brothers, but what he lacked in proportion, he compensated for in ambition. Unlike other Vanderbilts who built grand homes in New York or Newport to display power, George wanted something different. He wanted permanence. He wanted legacy. So he purchased 125,000 acres of land in rural North Carolina and began constructing what would become the largest privately owned home in the United States. Construction began in the late 1880s. Nearly 1,000 workers labored for years under the direction of architect Richard Morris Hunt. The design drew inspiration from the chateau of France's Loire Valley. Steeply pitched roofs, ornate stonework, towering chimneys, arched windows that caught the Appalachian light. When it was completed in 1895, Biltmore was not simply a residence. It was a declaration, 4 stories tall, with a basement and sub-basement, 35 bedrooms, more than 40 bathrooms, an almost unheard-of luxury at the time, a banquet hall with a ceiling soaring 7 stories high, a library containing tens of thousands of volumes, an indoor swimming pool in the 1890s, staff quarters for dozens of servants who ensured that life ran without friction. This was the world Cornelia was born into, and she was the only child. That fact changed everything. There would be no siblings to share the inheritance, no brother to assume control of the estate, no sister to divide attention. From the moment she drew her first breath, the future of Biltmore and a vast portion of the Vanderbilt fortune rested silently on her shoulders. But wealth, especially inherited wealth, does not simply provide comfort. It constructs expectation. Cornelia's mother, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, came from a respected political family on the East Coast. She embodied refinement, propriety, and discipline. She understood what society required from a Vanderbilt heiress: elegance, restraint, charitable engagement, and above all, loyalty to the family image. From infancy, Cornelia's life was structured. Tutors would educate her privately before she ever set foot in a classroom. Staff hovered nearby. Meals were formal. Appearances mattered. The Vanderbilt name carried weight in every introduction, every invitation, every social encounter. But Biltmore, for all its grandeur, was isolated. Outside its doors stretched miles of controlled landscape, forests, farmland, gardens meticulously designed by experts. Within its walls lived a rotating cast of maids, butlers, gardeners, secretaries, visiting relatives, and dignitaries. Yet for a child, the scale of it could feel hollow. Imagine learning to walk in corridors that echo. Imagine playing hide-and-seek in rooms so numerous you lose count. Imagine knowing, even as a girl, that nothing about your life is ordinary, and that it never will be. Cornelia grew up surrounded by beauty, privilege, and order, but she did not grow up surrounded by equals. No siblings, few children her age nearby. Her closest daily interactions were with adults, attentive, careful adults whose livelihoods depended on the stability of the Vanderbilt household. That kind of upbringing does something subtle to a child. It teaches awareness before innocence has time to fully develop. It instills observation. It sharpens sensitivity to atmosphere, tone, expectation. It can also create a quiet, persistent sense of separateness. By the time she was old enough to understand what her last name meant, Cornelia already sensed that her life had been drafted in advance. She would be educated impeccably. She would marry suitably. She would represent the Vanderbilt name with dignity. She would one day preside over Biltmore as its lady. There was no visible alternative. And yet, even in these early years, there were hints, faint but detectable, that Cornelia might not follow the script as cleanly as planned. She was observant, imaginative, slightly unconventional in temperament. Staff would later describe her as bright but inward, capable of deep thought and sudden intensity. In a house built to project strength and permanence, she was quietly developing a restless mind. At the dawn of the 20th century, America worshipped industrial wealth. Families like the Vanderbilts symbolized achievement, modernity, unstoppable progress. To be born into that name was to be born into certainty. But certainty can feel like confinement when choice is removed. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt began life as the unquestioned heiress of an empire. No one, not the staff, not society, not even her parents, could have predicted that the little girl born beneath Biltmore's stone towers would one day abandon it all. Yet the foundations of that decision were already forming, silently, inside the vast rooms of her childhood. To understand Cornelia, you must understand the scale of her world. Biltmore Estate was not merely large, it was overwhelming. Visitors arriving by carriage passed through miles of carefully designed landscape before the house itself revealed its limestone facade. The estate functioned like a self-contained kingdom. Farms, dairies, forests, workshops, guest wings, servant corridors hidden behind carved oak paneling. Inside, footsteps echoed. The banquet hall rose 7 stories high, its fireplace tall enough to stand inside. The library held more than 10,000 volumes, collected by George Washington Vanderbilt II, who was known less for ruthless business tactics and more for his love of art and literature. Massive tapestries lined the walls. Sunlight filtered through leaded glass. oil paintings watched from gilded frames. It was a monument to ambition. But for a child, monuments can feel cold. Cornelia did not wake to the sounds of neighborhood children playing outside. She woke to the quiet discipline of staff preparing the day. Meals were announced, lessons were scheduled, movements were observed, though never harshly. The Vanderbilt household operated with grace and constant awareness. She had freedom to roam, technically. The estate stretched for miles, and she could wander gardens designed by America's greatest landscape architects. She could peer into greenhouses filled with exotic plants. She could ride horses along wooded paths. Yet she did so largely alone. Being an only child in such an environment does not create obvious suffering. There were no shortages, no chaos, no neglect. In fact, there was abundance in every direction, but abundance without intimacy can create its own kind of isolation. Her earliest education took place at home under private tutors. History, languages, literature, etiquette, all delivered within those stone walls. She was taught how to sit properly at formal dinners before she understood the politics of the people seated around her. She learned which fork to use before she learned how ordinary families lived. The Vanderbilt name carried invisible rules. Appear composed, never embarrass the family, understand your place, at the top. And yet, the paradox of her upbringing was this. While the world viewed the Vanderbilts as symbols of power, inside Biltmore, life was structured but subdued. Her father preferred intellectual gatherings over ostentatious parties. Scholars, writers, and diplomats visited. Conversations revolved around culture and ideas. Not spectacle. Cornelia absorbed all of it. She listened more than she spoke. She watched how adults navigated power politely. She saw how wealth opened doors without knocking. She also sensed how that same wealth created distance. When other members of the extended Vanderbilt family visited during summers or holidays, Biltmore came alive with laughter and noise. But when they left, silence returned quickly, thick and noticeable. That silence shaped her. It encouraged imagination. It encouraged introspection. It also allowed unconventional thoughts to take root without immediate contradiction. By her early teens, Cornelia began attending the Madeira School in Virginia, an elite boarding school for girls. For the first time, she experienced daily life among peers her own age. She was no longer the sole young presence in a sea of adults. Yet even there, she stood apart. Everyone knew her name. Everyone understood what Vanderbilt meant. Wealth can create admiration. It can also create scrutiny. Cornelia was observed differently. Her clothing, her speech, her demeanor, all carried heightened meaning. She learned quickly that privilege did not eliminate pressure. It amplified it. Back at Biltmore during holidays, the contrast felt sharper. The house seemed larger after time away. The routines more pronounced. The expectations heavier. Meanwhile, history was shifting outside those walls. The early 20th century was an era of rapid change. Technological innovation, social movements, shifting roles for women. The suffrage movement gained momentum. Old aristocratic certainties were being questioned. Cornelia was growing up at the intersection of two eras, the fading grandeur of the Gilded Age and the restless modernity of a new century. In 1912, that tension between permanence and fragility would become terrifyingly real. That spring, Cornelia and her parents were in England and scheduled to return to the United States aboard the RMS Titanic, the ship confidently described as unsinkable. At the last moment, George Washington Vanderbilt II changed their travel plans. Concerns about a coal strike possibly delaying ships influenced his decision. They booked passage home a week earlier on a different vessel. Days later, Titanic struck an iceberg and sank into the Atlantic. More than 1,500 people died. Had her father not altered their itinerary, Cornelia's story might have ended at 12 years old, frozen in North Atlantic waters. It is difficult to measure how such a near miss affects a child. She did not witness the disaster directly. She did not stand on the deck as the ship tilted. But she understood what had nearly happened. Death had come close enough to touch the edges of her world. And then, 2 years later, tragedy struck much closer to home. In March 1914, her father underwent surgery to remove his appendix. The operation itself was considered routine. Complications followed. A blood clot traveled to his lung. He died at just 51 years old. This time, there was no escaping fate by changing tickets. At 13, Cornelia lost the intellectual center of her world. The man who built Biltmore, who filled it with books and art, who shaped its atmosphere of cultivated refinement, was gone. His estate, valued at approximately $50 million, passed largely into trusts overseen by her mother, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt. Cornelia would receive her inheritance fully when she reached adulthood. But inheritance is not comfort. Grief echoed through those vast halls in ways no architecture could soften. The banquet hall felt larger, the library quieter. The estate that once symbolized permanence suddenly revealed its vulnerability. For the second time in her young life, the illusion of security cracked. First the Titanic, then her father. Marble and stone could not prevent loss. From the outside, nothing seemed unstable. Biltmore still stood magnificent against the Carolina hills. The Vanderbilt name still commanded respect. Wealth still flowed through trusts and investments. But inside Cornelia, something shifted. She had glimpsed the fragility beneath grandeur, and once a child sees that, the world never looks entirely solid again. After her father's death, the atmosphere inside Biltmore Estate changed in ways subtle but undeniable. The house still operated with precision. The gardens were still trimmed. The fires still burned in the enormous hearths. But the intellectual warmth that George Washington Vanderbilt II had cultivated was gone. In its place stood responsibility. At 13, Cornelia was no longer simply a privileged child. She was the future of Biltmore. Her mother, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, assumed control of the estate and its financial structures. Edith was disciplined, composed, and fully aware of what the Vanderbilt name demanded. Under her guidance, Biltmore did not falter. If anything, it grew more efficient. The estate's agricultural operations expanded. Philanthropic efforts continued. Public image remained pristine. But Edith also understood something else. Her daughter could not grow up insulated forever. Cornelia's education became more formal, more deliberate, after her early tutoring at home and time at Madeira School. She briefly attended the University of North Carolina. It was an unusual step for a woman of her status at the time. Higher education for elite women was still emerging as a social norm, yet Cornelia did not complete a degree. Academics were never meant to define her future. Her future had already been outlined, though never explicitly spoken aloud. She would marry well, she would host elegantly, she would safeguard Biltmore, she would carry the Vanderbilt name forward. The expectation was not oppressive in tone. It was simply assumed. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, American high society still revolved around alliances, marriages that reinforced status and stability. For a Vanderbilt heiress, the pool of suitable partners was small and carefully observed. Cornelia entered adulthood aware that she was being evaluated. Newspapers followed the Vanderbilt family. Society pages recorded appearances and gatherings. Invitations arrived from powerful families across the United States and Europe. Her movements, though not scandalous, were noted. By 1921, when she turned 21, the financial dimension of her future became concrete. Trust funds began to release substantial annual income, reportedly around $2 million per year. Within a few years, she would receive a lump sum inheritance of approximately $5 million from her father's estate, the equivalent of nearly $100 million today. The numbers were staggering, but numbers did not answer a deeper question that was beginning to surface quietly inside her. What does one do when survival is never a concern? For most people, adulthood arrives with urgency: earn a living, build stability, secure a future. Cornelia had been born into secured permanence. That freedom, paradoxically, created its own uncertainty. She observed her extended Vanderbilt relatives. Some embraced extravagance, others clung to tradition, a few faded into quiet lives of private wealth. There were models to follow, but none that felt entirely like her own. By the early 1920s, she stood at the threshold of what society considered the most important chapter of a woman's life: marriage. It was during this period that she met John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat descended from one of England's most established aristocratic families. He was older, polished, steady, appropriate. His position as first secretary at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., placed him comfortably within the circles Cornelia moved in. Their match made sense. American industrial wealth joining British aristocratic lineage was a familiar pattern of the era. It reinforced status on both sides of the Atlantic. In April 1924, Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil at Biltmore, in an event that seemed to confirm the narrative everyone expected. Thousands of guests attended. Staff orchestrated every detail flawlessly. The Vanderbilt heiress had chosen well. At 23, Cornelia appeared to have stepped fully into her role. Soon after, she officially received her inheritance. The fortune was no longer theoretical. It was hers. Biltmore was hers. The future was hers. In 1925, she gave birth to her first son, George. In 1928, her second son, William, followed. From the outside, the image was immaculate: a grand estate, a titled husband, 2 healthy sons, a fortune secure. But something else was forming beneath the surface. Motherhood did not erase introspection. Wealth did not erase curiosity. The estate, once her childhood landscape, now became her administrative responsibility. She briefly took an active role in managing aspects of Biltmore in the early 1920s, learning its operational complexity: staff payrolls, agricultural output, maintenance costs, investments. She proved capable. Yet after her marriage, management gradually shifted more heavily toward her husband. This was not unusual for the era. It was expected. A husband oversaw operations. A wife presided socially. But Cornelia had grown up wandering those corridors alone. She knew their scale intimately. Watching authority transfer, even gently, created an invisible tension. Biltmore was her inheritance. Yet, increasingly, she felt like a ceremonial figure within it. By the end of the decade, America would enter the Great Depression. Financial strain would force unprecedented decisions about the estate's future. But even before that external pressure arrived, an internal restlessness had begun to take shape. The girl who once roamed marble halls imagining possibilities had become a woman positioned perfectly within society's design. And yet, perfection can feel suffocating when it leaves no room for reinvention. At 28, with 2 children and unlimited resources, Cornelia Vanderbilt stood at the center of everything she had been raised to achieve. No scandal, no tragedy, no obvious reason for dissatisfaction. But the quiet question that had followed her since adolescence was growing louder. If this life was decided before I could choose it, what would happen if I chose differently? That question would not remain theoretical for long. The heiress in waiting was about to become something no one had predicted. By the time the 1920s settled into their rhythm of jazz, champagne, and post-war optimism, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt appeared to be exactly where she was meant to be. She was no longer the solitary child wandering the corridors of Biltmore Estate. She was its lady. Her marriage to John Francis Amherst Cecil had been celebrated as a union of two historic bloodlines, American industrial wealth meeting British aristocratic lineage. It was elegant, appropriate, international. In April 1924, their wedding unfolded inside Biltmore with careful grandeur. Guests arrived in waves, dignitaries, diplomats, society figures from both sides of the Atlantic. Staff orchestrated the spectacle with quiet efficiency. The press recorded every detail. It was not merely a wedding, it was confirmation. The Vanderbilt heiress had fulfilled expectation. John Cecil was steady where Cornelia was inward, diplomatic, measured, disciplined, 10 years her senior. He carried himself with the composure of someone raised within a long tradition of British public service. If Cornelia represented American wealth, he represented European lineage. Together, they symbolized continuity. After the wedding, they settled at Biltmore as its central figures. Though Cornelia legally owned the estate through inheritance, it was understood that Cecil would take on increasing responsibility for its management. This arrangement followed convention. A husband oversaw operations. A wife presided over social life. Cornelia stepped into her role gracefully. She hosted formal dinners beneath the 7-story ceiling of the banquet hall. She entertained visiting officials, intellectuals, and relatives. She embodied the poise expected of a Vanderbilt heiress. In 1925, she gave birth to their first son, George, 3 years later. In 1928, their second son, William, arrived. The Vanderbilt line, at least through her branch, was secure. Photographs from the period show a composed young mother, fashionable yet restrained, standing beside her husband with 2 small boys positioned carefully before the stone facade of Biltmore. From the outside, it looked like permanence, but permanence can conceal movement beneath its surface. The 1920s were not a static decade. America was transforming. Women had gained the right to vote in 1920. Urban culture was shifting. Art, music, and social norms were evolving rapidly. The idea of female independence, once whispered, was becoming visible. Cornelia was observant enough to notice. Though she fulfilled her social duties, she did not immerse herself entirely in them. Hosting and philanthropy satisfied obligation, not identity. Beneath the gowns and formal receptions, she remained introspective, questioning, quietly alert to alternatives. Meanwhile, Biltmore itself demanded constant attention. Maintaining the largest private residence in America was not symbolic. It was expensive. Hundreds of employees, agricultural operations, preservation of architecture, utilities, modernization. The estate functioned almost like a small municipality. Cecil took increasing charge of these responsibilities. He approached management with British administrative precision. Under his oversight, the estate remained orderly and financially stable through much of the decade, but with each decision he made, Cornelia's direct involvement diminished. At first, it seemed practical. She had 2 young children. Social obligations filled her calendar. Delegation was logical. Yet something subtle began to shift. Biltmore had once been her inheritance. Tangible, personal, inevitable. Now it felt increasingly like a structure she inhabited rather than controlled. It was not resentment. It was displacement. The irony was sharp. The estate built by her father, intended to anchor his branch of the Vanderbilt legacy, was gradually operating under the authority of her husband, in public. There was no tension, no scandal, no visible discord. Privately, the emotional landscape was more complex. Cornelia did not express dissatisfaction openly, but those close to the family would later note that she was never fully at ease in the traditional role of a demure estate wife. She had been raised among books and ideas, not merely ballrooms and schedules. She sought stimulation beyond social ritual. By the late 1920s, financial pressure began to loom over even the wealthiest families. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression followed. Fortunes contracted. Investments shrank. Confidence evaporated nationwide. Even Biltmore was not immune, though the Vanderbilt fortune was immense. Maintaining such a vast estate during economic collapse required strategic decisions. In 1930, an unprecedented choice was made. Portions of Biltmore would be open to the public for paid tours, for America's grandest private residence. This was revolutionary. Old money aristocracy did not typically monetize their homes by inviting tourists through their halls. Yet practicality outweighed pride. The estate needed sustainable revenue. Visitors began walking through the banquet hall, through the library, through corridors that had once been reserved exclusively for family and guests. For Cornelia, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Her childhood home, once a sanctuary of privacy and power, was becoming a public attraction. The shift was financially sound. It would ultimately secure Biltmore's long-term survival. But emotionally, it altered the meaning of the place. The house that had defined her identity was changing function, and so was she. By the early 1930s, her sons were still young, 7 and 4. Cecil was firmly entrenched in management. The estate had adapted to economic realities from society's perspective. The marriage was intact, stable, admirable, yet internally, Cornelia felt something harder to articulate: stagnation. Her days were structured but repetitive. Duties were performed but not transformative. The world beyond Biltmore was evolving rapidly. Art, politics, culture. While her own environment revolved around preservation, she had grown up in grandeur. She had married within expectation. She had produced heirs. She had fulfilled every visible obligation placed before her. And yet, fulfillment felt incomplete. The question that had followed her since adolescence returned with sharper clarity. If this is the life I was meant to live, why does it feel unfinished? The Great Depression had forced Biltmore to adapt. Soon, Cornelia would force something far more radical. She would not simply adjust the estate's operations. She would step outside the estate entirely. And when she did, it would shock American high society more than any financial decision ever could. By 1932, the illusion of permanence had thinned. The Great Depression had not destroyed Biltmore Estate, but it had exposed its fragility. Opening the house to public tours in 1930 was financially practical, even visionary, yet symbolically seismic. What had once been a private monument to the Vanderbilt name now welcomed paying strangers into its corridors. Tour guides spoke where family members once walked in silence. Footsteps of tourists replaced the measured pace of invited guests. The banquet hall became spectacle for Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt. The change was not merely operational, it was existential. Biltmore had defined her identity since birth. Now, it was redefining itself. Meanwhile, her personal life followed a pattern outwardly stable but inwardly narrowing. John Francis Amherst. Cecil managed the estate with competence and restraint. Staff respected him. Finances stabilized under his oversight. He was reliable, the kind of husband society approved of. But reliability does not guarantee resonance. Cornelia's role had become increasingly ceremonial. She hosted, attended functions, maintained appearances. Her sons, George and William, were growing, energetic, curious, absorbing both American and British influences through their father. Motherhood grounded her. Yet it did not silence the restlessness that had begun years earlier. She had been raised among ideas, books, and cultivated conversation, yet her daily life revolved around repetition, formal meals, scheduled events, carefully curated interactions. There were no arguments dramatic enough to headline newspapers, no public scandals, no visible unhappiness that outsiders could point to and say, "There, that is the problem." The problem was quieter. It was the realization that she had followed every prescribed step and still felt unfinished. In the early 1930s, New York City pulsed with a different energy. Even amid economic collapse, it remained a center of artistic experimentation. Galleries showcased modern art that defied tradition. Writers questioned old hierarchies. Women carved unconventional paths as painters, performers, thinkers. Cornelia began traveling to New York more frequently. At first, these visits seemed harmless, cultural outings, extended stays framed as enrichment. But gradually, they became refuge. In 1932, when her sons were only 7 and 4, she made a decision that stunned those closest to her. She left Biltmore, not permanently, not yet, but decisively. She relocated to New York and enrolled in art classes for a Vanderbilt heiress. This was unconventional to the point of rebellion. Wealthy women collected art. They sponsored exhibitions. They did not typically study it as students. Sitting in studios, sketching, absorbing criticism, the act itself was symbolic. Cornelia was not rejecting wealth. She was rejecting confinement. In New York, she could exist without the immediate shadow of Biltmore's stone towers. She could introduce herself without first being identified as the lady of the estate. She could experiment, quietly at first, with a version of herself untethered from inherited expectation. Yet even New York was transitional. Within months, her restlessness pushed further. If Biltmore represented inherited identity, and New York represented temporary escape, Europe represented reinvention. In 1933, she crossed the Atlantic. This was not a social tour. It was not a brief cultural visit. It was departure. Paris became her new center. At the time, Paris was a magnet for artists, writers, and intellectuals seeking freedom from rigid national structures. It offered anonymity to those willing to step outside convention. Cornelia did not merely move continents. She moved away from everything that defined her publicly. The following year, in 1934, she finalized her divorce from John Francis Amherst Cecil. Divorce in elite circles was not unheard of, but it carried weight, especially for someone of her status. American high society reacted with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Why would a woman with limitless resources, a respected husband, and a secured legacy choose rupture? Even more perplexing, after the divorce, Cecil remained at Biltmore, continuing to manage the estate. The structure she had inherited would remain under her former husband's control. Cornelia did not fight for symbolic authority. She walked away, and then she did something even more shocking. She changed her name. In Europe, she adopted the name Nilchauer, a reconfiguration rooted in her growing interest in mysticism and numerology. She began to believe in the influence of colors and personal auras soon after. She dyed her hair pink. The Vanderbilt heiress, raised under strict codes of decorum, appeared in European circles with bright hair and unconventional clothing choices. Later, she would dye it blue. These were not random aesthetic experiments. They were expressions of a deeper shift. She was dismantling the identity constructed for her piece by piece. Name, marriage, geography, appearance. Each change severed another thread connecting her to the woman society expected her to remain. Meanwhile, her sons continued their education in Britain and Switzerland, moving between continents during holidays. She did not disappear from their lives, but her relationship with them now existed across borders, in America. Whispers multiplied. Had she lost stability? Was this eccentricity temporary? Was Europe corrupting her? From her perspective, the transformation felt less like chaos and more like clarity. For the first time in her life, her choices were not predetermined. She was no longer the only child inside a vast estate, no longer the carefully positioned wife of a British diplomat, no longer the ceremonial guardian of Biltmore's image. She was something undefined, and undefined was dangerous, particularly for someone whose entire upbringing had emphasized order. But liberation often begins where certainty ends. By the mid-1930s, Cornelia Vanderbilt, now Nilchauer, had crossed a psychological threshold. She had not merely stepped outside expectation, she had dismantled it, and the further she moved from America, the less likely it became that she would ever return to the life waiting for her in North Carolina. The cracks in the marble were no longer hidden. The heiress had begun to vanish. What followed would entrench her reputation not just as unconventional, but as enigmatic. By the mid-1930s, the transformation was no longer subtle. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt had not only left Biltmore Estate, she had severed the emotional contract that tied her to it. In Paris, she moved through artistic and intellectual circles with a freedom she had never known in North Carolina. She explored painting seriously. She immersed herself in mysticism and numerology, convinced that colors radiated energy, that names carried vibrational meaning, that identity was fluid rather than fixed. The Vanderbilt name had been assigned to her at birth. Nilchauer was chosen to American society. The shift looked theatrical. Hair dyed pink, then blue. Clothing selected according to the aura she believed surrounded her. Public appearances that defied aristocratic restraint. But beneath the surface eccentricity was something far more radical. She was experimenting with authorship over her own life for decades. Every major chapter had been structured by inheritance, expectation, or social alignment: birth into wealth, groomed education, suitable marriage, estate management, motherhood within tradition. Now, she was self-directing. That act alone was revolutionary for a woman of her status in the 1930s. Her divorce from John Francis Amherst Cecil in 1934 finalized the break. It was quiet, without explosive scandal. No courtroom drama dominated headlines, but its symbolism was sharp. The Vanderbilt heiress had rejected the marriage that reinforced her social position. Even more striking, she did not return to America after the divorce. She did not reestablish herself at Biltmore. She did not attempt to reclaim operational authority over the estate. She allowed Cecil to remain in charge, for many observers. This was incomprehensible. Why walk away from control of the largest private home in America? Why relinquish proximity to generational power? The answer may lie not in financial logic, but psychological distance. Biltmore represented childhood. It represented her father's ambition. It represented inherited identity. Returning would mean stepping back into a narrative she had already dismantled. Instead, she stayed in Europe. Her sons, George and William, were educated in Britain and Switzerland. They lived what could be described as a transatlantic existence, holidays sometimes spent at Biltmore with their father, school terms in Europe, periodic time with their mother. It was unconventional. It was complex, but it was functional. Then, history intervened. In 1939, the Second World War erupted. Europe, the continent she had chosen for reinvention, transformed into a battlefield. Paris fell under Nazi occupation in 1940, like many expatriates. Cornelia relocated to Britain. The war years compressed reality. Glamour faded, survival sharpened priorities. Her sons, raised largely within British systems, eventually joined the British Royal Navy. It was a direct consequence of her relocation years earlier. Had she remained in America, their allegiance might have been different. In 1943, fate repeated an eerie pattern from her youth. George and William were attempting to travel from neutral Switzerland to England. Their route was complex, through Vichy, France, across neutral Spain, into Portugal, and then onward by air from Lisbon. They were scheduled to board a particular flight at the last minute. They were bumped. The plane they were meant to take was later shot down by German forces over the Bay of Biscay. Everyone on board died, including the famous British actor Leslie Howard. The near miss echoed 1912. Once again, catastrophe passed inches away from her family. First the Titanic, now a Nazi attack. Twice. History had nearly erased the Vanderbilt branch she carried. For Cornelia, whose belief in mysticism had deepened over time, these events reinforced a conviction that fate followed her life closely, dangerously closely. After the war ended in 1945, Europe began rebuilding. So did she. In 1949, she married again, this time to Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson, a decorated veteran of the First World War who later built a successful career in banking. The wedding was nothing like her first. No grand ceremony beneath towering ceilings. No transatlantic spectacle. They married in a simple registry office in Kensington, London. She adopted yet another name during this period, Mary. Why? The answer remains partially speculative. Privacy. Perhaps distance from publicity. A further shedding of Vanderbilt visibility. This second marriage proved steadier. She and Vivian divided their time between a London residence and an estate in the Cotswolds called the Mount. There, they developed eclectic collecting habits, particularly historic Chinese vases, which would later be donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum. The life she built with Vivian was quieter, less scrutinized, less symbolically loaded. She did not return to America, not for social events, not for nostalgia, not even for grief. When her mother, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, died in 1958, Cornelia did not travel back for the funeral. That absence stunned observers more than any hair color ever had. Family tradition mattered intensely within the Vanderbilt dynasty. Attendance at major life events reinforced unity and continuity. Her refusal to return signaled something definitive. She had not simply relocated, she had disavowed. Meanwhile, at Biltmore, her former husband remained until his death in 1954. Afterward, her sons would assume greater responsibility for the estate's operations, eventually stabilizing it as a historic house museum and securing its designation as a National Historic Landmark in 1963. The physical structure endured, but Cornelia's connection to it had transformed into memory rather than presence. By the 1960s, she was no longer seen as the Vanderbilt heiress who abandoned America. She had become an enigmatic European figure, wealthy, eccentric, private. In 1968, Vivian died. It was the end of the calmest chapter of her adult life. Yet even then, she did not return across the Atlantic. Instead, she remained in England, later marrying a third time in 1972 to William Goodsir, a man 26 years younger whom she had met during a dinner in London at 72. She continued to redefine expectation. When she died in 1976 in Oxfordshire, she was cremated, breaking yet another Vanderbilt tradition of burial in the family crypt on Staten Island. Her ashes were eventually placed with those of her final husband in Scotland. She had begun life in America's grandest private mansion. She ended it far from its stone walls. Why she chose that path remains debated. Was it rebellion, restlessness, a search for authenticity, or an instinctive refusal to be preserved like the estate she inherited? Perhaps the answer lies in the pattern visible across her life. Twice. Fate nearly claimed her. Twice. She stepped away from destruction, again and again. She chose motion over monument. The girl born beneath carved limestone towers became the woman who refused to live inside them. And in doing so, she ensured that while Biltmore would remain fixed in history, Cornelia Vanderbilt would remain impossible to define. By the time Europe descended fully into chaos in 1939, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was no longer seen as an American heiress in exile. She was something harder to categorize. She had lived in Paris long enough to detach from the rhythm of American society. She had redefined her name, her appearance, her social circle. She had divorced John Francis Amherst Cecil and refused to resume her place at Biltmore Estate. She had crossed the Atlantic not as a visitor, but as a permanent departure. But war does not respect reinvention. When Nazi forces occupied France in 1940, Paris ceased to be a haven for artists and expatriates. It became a city under control. Movement was restricted. Uncertainty spread. Cornelia relocated to Britain. The decision was practical. Her sons were being educated within British systems. Her former husband's background connected them naturally to the United Kingdom. And despite her rejection of American society, she was still Western, still aligned with allied nations. The war years stripped away much of the eccentric glamour that had surrounded her transformation. There were no salons filled with avant-garde conversation, no playful discussions of aura colors. Europe was fighting for survival. Her sons, George and William, now young men, eventually joined the British Royal Navy. That choice was not accidental. Had Cornelia remained in America, their allegiances might have followed a different path. Instead, they wore British uniforms, served under the crown, and faced the same dangers as thousands of other young men their age. For Cornelia, the war collapsed abstraction into immediacy. She had once flirted with mysticism and self-reinvention. Now she waited for news from battlefronts. The vulnerability she had glimpsed in 1912 and 1914 returned. Magnified. In 1943, a journey nearly ended everything. George and William were attempting to reach England from neutral Switzerland. The route required navigating a fractured Europe. Through Vichy-controlled France, across neutral Spain, into Portugal. From Lisbon, they would board a civilian aircraft bound for Britain. They had seats reserved. At the last moment, they were removed from the flight. Accounts differ slightly on the details, but what is certain is this. The plane they were originally scheduled to board was later shot down by German forces over the Bay of Biscay. All passengers were killed. Among them was the well-known British actor Leslie Howard. Famous for his role in Gone with the Wind, George and William, instead, boarded a different aircraft and arrived safely. The pattern was unmistakable. In 1912, her family avoided the Titanic by altering travel plans. In 1943, her sons avoided a Nazi attack by being bumped from a flight, twice. Death had approached with precision. For a woman already inclined toward numerology and unseen forces, The repetition could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. War ended in 1945, but its psychological imprint lingered. Cornelia emerged from the conflict not triumphant, but confirmed in a belief she had been cultivating for years. Life was precarious. Structures were temporary. Destiny was unpredictable. And if destiny could change in an instant, then clinging to inherited permanence made even less sense. Biltmore, magnificent, stable, historic, had survived the Depression and the war. But Cornelia had long ago detached her identity from its stone walls. She had seen how quickly ships sank, how suddenly blood clots formed, how swiftly aircraft fell from the sky. In the face of that fragility, what was a mansion? The war also altered her social landscape. Post-war Britain was economically strained, rationed, rebuilding. Aristocratic glamour felt outdated. Wealth carried new political sensitivity. Public attitudes toward inherited privilege shifted. Cornelia adapted again. In 1949, she married Vivian Francis Bulkley Johnson. Vivian was not a symbol of inherited dynasty. He was a decorated veteran of the First World War who had built a career in banking. His identity was rooted in service and professional achievement rather than ancestral empire. Their wedding took place in a registry office in Kensington. Understated, efficient, almost deliberately unremarkable. It was the opposite of her 1924 spectacle at Biltmore. There were no marble halls, no towering fireplaces, no society reporters cataloging gowns, just signatures. The simplicity was telling. Cornelia no longer needed ceremony to validate her choices. With Vivian, she settled into a quieter rhythm. They maintained a residence in London and acquired an estate in the Cotswolds known as the Mount. The countryside offered privacy, greenery, distance from scrutiny. Together, they developed a shared interest in collecting historic Chinese vases. Rare, intricate, valuable. Unlike the inherited art at Biltmore, these objects were selected intentionally, curated, not assumed. Later, many of these pieces would be donated to London's Victoria and Albert Museum, a gesture aligning with preservation rather than display. This second marriage proved stable. There were no sudden relocations, no public eccentricities dominating gossip columns. The flamboyant aura of pink hair faded into a more measured presence. Cornelia, now often using the name Mary, had passed through rebellion and into something resembling equilibrium. Yet even equilibrium did not pull her back to America. She did not visit Biltmore to reclaim nostalgia. She did not reinsert herself into Vanderbilt gatherings. She did not attend her mother's funeral in 1958. The distance had become permanent. When Vivian died in 1968, she faced widowhood again. But this time, the grief did not provoke flight. She remained in England, in the home she had chosen, in the country she had adopted. The heiress who once stood at the center of America's grandest estate had become a quiet, somewhat enigmatic figure in rural Oxfordshire. Her sons, meanwhile, took greater responsibility for Biltmore, transforming it fully into a historic house museum and ensuring its financial sustainability. In 1963, it was designated a National Historic Landmark. The building endured, but its original heiress lived an ocean away. If the early chapters of Cornelia's life were about inheritance, and the middle chapters about rebellion, the war years crystallized something deeper. She did not trust permanence. She trusted movement, and as she entered the final decades of her life, that instinct to redefine, to detach, to reshape, would surface one last time in a decision that surprised even those who thought they understood her. The woman who had abandoned a dynasty was not finished defying expectation. When Vivian Francis Bulkley Johnson died in 1968, a chapter of unusual stability closed in the life of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt for nearly 2 decades. Her marriage to Vivian had provided something she had rarely experienced: steadiness without spectacle. There had been no dramatic departures, no theatrical reinventions splashed across society pages. Their life between London and the Mount in the Cotswolds had been cultured, private, deliberate. Widowhood, however, has a way of reopening old questions. By the late 1960s, the world had shifted again. The rigid social hierarchies of the early 20th century had softened. Counterculture movements challenged tradition. Art therapy and psychological exploration gained legitimacy in ways that would have seemed fringe decades earlier. Cornelia, who had once embraced mysticism and color auras, found herself drawn toward a different kind of exploration: art as healing. She developed an interest in the emerging field of art therapy and became acquainted with one of its early advocates, Edward Adamson. Adamson worked with psychiatric patients, encouraging creative expression as a means of psychological recovery. For a woman who had spent much of her life redefining identity, the concept resonated. Art was no longer rebellion. It was introspection structured into practice. It was during this period, at a dinner in London, that something unexpected occurred. The waiter serving the table was a man named William Goodsir. He was 26 years younger than Cornelia, in another era. Such an age gap, particularly with the woman older, would have been scandalous beyond repair. But by the early 1970s, society's rigidity had loosened, and Cornelia had long ago stopped calibrating her life to external approval. Their acquaintance developed into companionship. In 1972, at the age of 72, Cornelia married William Goodsir. It was her third marriage, once again. The ceremony was modest: no transatlantic headlines, no grand halls, no ancestral symbolism, just 2 individuals making a decision. Observers reacted with predictable curiosity. The heiress, who had once shocked society by abandoning America, now surprised them by choosing a partner from a different generation and background. But for Cornelia, the pattern was consistent. She had never valued lineage for its own sake. She had valued autonomy. With William, she settled into a quieter life at the Mount. The pace slowed. Public appearances diminished. She did not seek renewed notoriety. If anything, she receded further from visibility. Her sons, George and William, continued strengthening the operations of Biltmore Estate in America. They expanded its function as a historic house museum, stabilizing finances and professionalizing management. By the 1960s, the estate had firmly transitioned from private aristocratic residence to cultural landmark. In 1963, Biltmore had been designated a National Historic Landmark. Its survival was secured. Ironically, the structure her father built for permanence had achieved exactly that: endurance beyond its original domestic purpose. Cornelia, meanwhile, remained physically and emotionally distant from it. She did not return for ceremonies celebrating its preservation. She did not attempt to reshape its narrative to include her own transformation. The house existed in history. She existed in motion. In 1976, at the age of 75, Cornelia died in Oxfordshire. Her passing did not trigger the kind of grand American mourning that once might have accompanied the death of a Vanderbilt heiress. She had removed herself too completely, too deliberately. For that, her body was cremated. This decision alone marked another quiet break with tradition. Many members of the extended Vanderbilt family were interred in the family mausoleum on Staten Island in New York, a monumental resting place reflecting the dynasty's 19th century grandeur. Cornelia chose otherwise. Her ashes were placed near her English home. Years later, when William Goodsir died in 1984, her remains were united with his and buried together in Scotland. The symbolism was subtle but unmistakable. She had not returned to the Vanderbilt crypt. She had not rejoined the ancestral narrative in death. She had defined her own ending, looking back across her life. Patterns emerge. Born into one of the wealthiest families in American history, nearly claimed by the Titanic before adolescence, orphaned young by her father's sudden death, married into British aristocracy, divorced and relocated to Europe, reinvented herself through mysticism and art, survived a second near catastrophe during World War II, married again, quietly, married a third time, defiantly, refused to return even for her mother's funeral, chose cremation over crypt. Each decision moved her further from predetermined identity, and yet, paradoxically, her legacy remained tethered to the very estate she left behind. Today, Biltmore welcomes more than 1 million visitors annually. Tour guides recount the history of George Washington Vanderbilt II, the architecture, the agricultural innovations, the preservation efforts of her sons. Cornelia's story is mentioned, often framed as the eccentric heiress who dyed her hair pink and abandoned America. But reducing her life to eccentricity oversimplifies it. Her choices, while unconventional, followed a coherent internal logic: reject confinement, pursue authenticity, detach from inherited script. She did not dismantle Biltmore. She dismantled expectation. In an era when women of her status were expected to embody continuity, she embodied divergence, and perhaps that is why her life continues to fascinate. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was eccentric, but because she had everything designed for permanence and chose impermanence instead. The heiress who could have lived and died beneath carved limestone ceilings instead crossed oceans, renamed herself, recolored herself, and wrote her own final chapter far from the mansion that once defined her, and in doing so, she ensured that while Biltmore stands solid against the Carolina hills, Cornelia Vanderbilt remains fluid, elusive, and impossible to confine to a single narrative. When Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt died in 1976, there was no grand procession through the gates of Biltmore Estate, no black carriages lining the gravel drive, no solemn return to the Vanderbilt Mausoleum on Staten Island, no symbolic reunion with the dynasty she had once represented. Instead, her passing was quiet: cremation, ashes laid to rest in Britain, later united with those of William Goodsir in Scotland, in death. As in life, she chose separation from tradition. Yet while Cornelia distanced herself from the Vanderbilt identity, the institution she inherited did not fade. It evolved. After the death of John Francis Amherst Cecil in 1954, her sons George and William gradually took fuller control of Biltmore's operations. They understood something essential: preservation required adaptation. Opening the estate to public tours during the Great Depression had been a survival measure. Under their leadership, it became a structured enterprise. They transformed the mansion into a professional historic house museum. Visitor infrastructure expanded, marketing modernized, agricultural and winery ventures diversified revenue streams. The estate ceased to function as a private aristocratic residence and became a cultural landmark. In 1963, Biltmore was officially designated a National Historic Landmark. The stone towers her father envisioned as a permanent legacy achieved exactly that. Today, more than 1 million visitors each year walk through rooms where Cornelia once wandered alone as a child. They photograph the banquet hall, peer into the library her father curated, stroll gardens designed for grandeur rather than utility. They hear stories about the Vanderbilt dynasty, about Cornelius Vanderbilt and railroad empires, about industrial wealth and Gilded Age ambition. And somewhere within those tours, Cornelia appears. Often she is summarized in a few striking details: the heiress who left, the woman who dyed her hair pink, the Vanderbilt who never came home. But that shorthand misses the complexity of what she represented. Cornelia did not destroy Biltmore. She did not squander her inheritance. She did not collapse into scandal. She simply refused to let inherited architecture define her internal landscape. Her life poses an uncomfortable question to narratives of wealth and legacy. If you are given permanence, do you have the right to reject it? For many in her position, the answer would have been no. Wealth carries obligation. Legacy demands stewardship. Tradition insists on continuity. Cornelia challenged that framework. She fulfilled her responsibilities where necessary. Her sons were educated, her inheritance preserved, the estate financially secured, but she did not sacrifice autonomy to maintain appearance. Even her most eccentric phases, the name Nilchauer, the aura colors, the pink and blue hair, were not random acts of rebellion. They were symbolic experiments in authorship. If identity had been assigned at birth, she would rewrite it repeatedly until it felt chosen. The repetition across her life is striking. Near death aboard the Titanic, avoided. Near death in wartime aviation, avoided. Near total absorption into aristocratic expectation, avoided. Time and again. She stepped sideways from the script. Her refusal to return to America, not even for her mother's funeral in 1958, remains one of the most discussed decisions of her life. To some, it signaled cold detachment. To others, it reflected the final severing of an emotional tether that had defined her since childhood. But distance does not always equal rejection. Sometimes it is preservation. Returning to Biltmore would have meant confronting a self she had consciously outgrown. Remaining in Europe allowed her to live without the gravitational pull of ancestral identity. And yet, paradoxically, the estate flourished without her presence. Perhaps that is the quiet irony of her story. The house survived her departure. The legacy stabilized without her supervision. The dynasty continued through her sons and grandchildren. Her absence did not erase history. Instead, it highlighted something unexpected. The Vanderbilt empire was strong enough to endure autonomy in the decades following her death. Historians and biographers have debated her motivations. Was she escaping an unhappy marriage, rejecting societal constraints, seeking spiritual meaning, simply restless? The answer is likely layered. She was born into unimaginable privilege, but privilege does not eliminate the need for self-definition. In fact, it can intensify it. When survival is guaranteed, identity becomes the central struggle. Cornelia Vanderbilt's life was not a tragedy. It was not a scandal. It was not a cautionary tale. It was an assertion. She asserted that inheritance does not equal destiny, that architecture does not equal identity, that even within the most rigid structures, movement is possible. Today, Biltmore stands exactly where her father placed it: vast, ornate, immovable against the Carolina horizon. Visitors walk through preserved rooms, imagining the grandeur of a bygone era. Few imagine the young girl standing in those corridors, sensing both privilege and confinement. Fewer still consider that the most radical act in a dynasty built on accumulation was not building something bigger. It was walking away. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt began life as the unquestioned heiress of an American empire. She ended it as something rarer, a woman who chose herself over inheritance. And in doing so, she transformed what could have been a predictable chapter in Vanderbilt history into a story that still unsettles and fascinates nearly a century later. Long after Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt had chosen Europe over America, the physical symbol of her inheritance continued standing, massive, deliberate, unyielding. Biltmore Estate was never designed to be temporary. When George Washington Vanderbilt II commissioned it in the late 19th century, he was not building a seasonal retreat. He was constructing permanence, yet permanence requires strategy. After World War II, America changed rapidly. Industrial fortunes shifted hands. Old aristocratic families either modernized or faded into nostalgic irrelevance. Maintaining a 250-room mansion in a democratic, increasingly practical society was not just expensive, it was culturally complicated. When John Francis Amherst Cecil died in 1954, operational control at Biltmore transitioned more decisively to Cornelia's sons. George and William, they faced a choice: preserve Biltmore as a private monument and risk financial erosion, or transform it into a sustainable enterprise. They chose transformation. Opening the estate to the public during the Great Depression had been a necessity. Now it became philosophy. Biltmore would no longer represent inherited exclusivity. It would represent curated history. Tours expanded. Visitor pathways were refined. Narratives were structured for educational impact. The agricultural base, once built to sustain a private estate, evolved into diversified revenue streams, including farming operations and, later, winemaking ventures. The mansion adapted. In 1963, federal recognition solidified its cultural status. Biltmore was designated a National Historic Landmark. The house her father built achieved official historical immortality. Ironically, this institutional permanence contrasted sharply with Cornelia's own life choices. While the estate was being preserved in amber, polished, narrated, protected, she was living in rural England, far from the Carolina hills, detached from the physical structure that bore her childhood memories. There is something striking about that contrast. Biltmore became fixed in time. Cornelia refused to be. Visitors walking through the estate today encounter a carefully curated past. They see portraits, original furnishings, preserved architectural details. They hear stories about Vanderbilt ambition, industrial empires, architectural vision. They do not feel the quiet solitude of an only child growing up within those walls. They do not sense the psychological weight of inheritance. They experience grandeur, not confinement, and perhaps that is appropriate. Biltmore, as an institution, was always about projection, wealth, culture, stability, legacy. Cornelia's life, by contrast, was about deconstruction. By the 1970s, as the estate solidified its identity as a historic landmark, she was entering her final years in Oxfordshire. She had married William Goodsir in 1972. The age difference, 26 years, intrigued observers, but their life together at the Mount was quiet, almost understated. No dramatic reinventions remained, no vibrant hair colors dominating society columns, no transatlantic speculation. If her early departures had been explosive, her later years were contemplative. She read, she maintained limited social circles. She engaged with art and conversation rather than spectacle. When she died in 1976, it marked the end of the only direct Vanderbilt heir to have permanently left Biltmore behind. Her sons continued stewarding the estate. Through them, and through 8 grandchildren, the Vanderbilt presence at Biltmore persisted. Today, descendants remain involved in management. The estate attracts approximately 1.4 million visitors annually. It functions as both tourist attraction and living business. In purely economic terms, it thrives. And yet, the story of Cornelia lingers around it like an unresolved note. The house symbolizes endurance. She symbolizes autonomy. It is tempting to frame her life as contradiction, the heiress who rejected her inheritance. But perhaps the more accurate framing is evolution. Her father built Biltmore to anchor a branch of the Vanderbilt dynasty in permanence. Her sons ensured that permanence by adapting it to modern realities. Cornelia ensured something else entirely, that the individual could exist apart from the monument in American mythology. Wealth often equals destiny. Those born into dynasties are expected to reinforce them. Continuity is admired. Departure is questioned. Cornelia departed anyway. She did not sabotage the estate. She did not dismantle the dynasty. She simply chose not to inhabit it. And that choice reshaped how her story is remembered. If she had remained at Biltmore, managed its operations, presided over its transformation into a museum, her life might be summarized as dutiful. Instead, it is summarized as enigmatic. The mansion that refused to fall stands in North Carolina, vast and photogenic. The woman who refused to stay remains more difficult to frame. Perhaps that is why her story endures. Not because she dyed her hair pink, not because she married 3 times, not because she nearly boarded the Titanic, but because she posed a question that still resonates. What happens when someone born into history decides not to live inside it? Biltmore answers with stone and preservation. Cornelia answered with movement, and in the tension between those two responses lies the true intrigue of her life. By the time the 1970s arrived, the name Vanderbilt had already shifted from raw power to curated legend. The era of railroad monopolies and steamship empires, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt, belonged to history books. The Gilded Age glitter had dulled into museum exhibits and academic studies. America had moved through 2 world wars, a depression, cultural revolutions. Yet certain names refused to dissolve. Vanderbilt was one of them. And so, even though Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt had spent decades in England, even though she had shed appearances, titles, even expectations, the surname followed her. In Britain, she had once been Viscountess Cecil through her marriage to John Francis Amherst Cecil. Later, she was Mrs. Bulkley Johnson. Finally, Mrs. Goodsir. But journalists rarely used those names without attaching the phrase Vanderbilt Heiress. It became a permanent subtitle to her existence. In some ways, it was the final paradox of her life. She could leave the estate. She could leave the country. She could leave the marriage. She could not leave the narrative. Meanwhile, back in North Carolina, Biltmore Estate was evolving into something her father may never have imagined. A carefully managed brand. Historic preservation became not only cultural duty, but strategic marketing. Holiday tours, educational programming, agricultural ventures expanded into vineyards and wineries. Hospitality services developed across the property. The estate became both memory and machine. Visitors came not only for architecture, but for experience. They purchased tickets, souvenirs, wine bottles labeled with the Biltmore crest. They walked manicured paths through gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. They left with photographs and narratives shaped for accessibility, history, curated, and yet, in the official storyline. Cornelia remained a complicated figure. She did not neatly fit into the triumphal arc of Vanderbilt expansion. She did not represent architectural innovation or agricultural development. She did not oversee financial stabilization. She represented divergence. For historians, this made her fascinating. For institutions, it made her difficult. How do you present an heiress who walked away without framing her as tragic? Rebellious or eccentric? Over time, interpretations softened, rather than depicting her departure as scandalous. Modern historians increasingly describe it as personal evolution. They note her artistic interests, her engagement with spiritual exploration, her marriages not as failures, but as phases of reinvention. Context. Changes perception. In the 1930s, dyeing one's hair pink signaled instability. In the 1970s, it signaled individuality. Today, it barely raises an eyebrow. Similarly, divorce among aristocracy once carried stigma. By mid-century, it was becoming normalized. Cornelia had often simply moved earlier than society. That pattern repeats across her life. She rejected inherited expectations before autonomy for women of her class was widely accepted. She explored spiritual and psychological self-examination before it became mainstream discourse. She chose cremation, separating herself from the Vanderbilt mausoleum decades before such choices were commonplace in elite American families. Each decision positioned her slightly ahead of cultural comfort, and that is perhaps why her story feels modern. In the 21st century, identity is often framed as fluid, constructed, self-authored. The idea that one might distance themselves from inherited roles resonates strongly today. Cornelia enacted that philosophy long before it became fashionable. Meanwhile, Biltmore continues standing, solid and symmetrical. It has outlived the industrial age that funded it. It has outlived the aristocratic conventions that defined it. It has outlived even the immediate generation that once inhabited it. But unlike Cornelia, it never moved. The estate represents continuity. She represents choice. When she died in 1976 in Oxfordshire, there were no elaborate Vanderbilt rituals reclaiming her story. Her ashes remained in Britain. Later, they were interred with William Goodsir in Scotland. She did not rejoin the American branch of the dynasty in death. And yet, her bloodline continues at Biltmore through her descendants. Family members remain involved in oversight and leadership. The Vanderbilt presence persists, not through her direct participation, but through generational continuity, in that sense. She did not abandon legacy. She redefined proximity to it. You can belong to history without living inside it. You can preserve inheritance without inhabiting expectation today. When Americans tour Biltmore, they often experience awe. The scale is overwhelming, the craftsmanship meticulous, the gardens expansive. It feels permanent. But permanence is an illusion built through maintenance, adaptation, and reinvention. In that way, perhaps Cornelia and Biltmore are not opposites at all. The estate reinvented itself to survive. So did she. The difference lies only in form. Stone transformed into museum. Heiress transformed into individual. Both endured, but only one chose to walk away first. And perhaps that, more than any architectural detail or financial record, is what keeps Cornelia Vanderbilt's story echoing long after the dynasty that named her has settled into curated history. In the end, the most revealing portrait of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt is not found in the halls of Biltmore Estate. It is found in the pattern of her decisions. From childhood, she lived inside a structure designed to define her. Biltmore was not merely a home. It was a statement carved into limestone, a declaration that the Vanderbilt name belonged among the architectural legends of Europe. Her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, built permanence. Her grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, built power. Cornelia inherited both, and quietly stepped aside from embodying either. To understand her life, one must resist the temptation to frame it as rebellion for its own sake. She was not a reckless destroyer of tradition. She did not squander her inheritance in spectacle. She did not attempt to dismantle her family's legacy. She simply refused to let it consume her identity. The psychological tension of being an only child in an empire of expectation is difficult to overstate. After her father's sudden death in 1914, the symbolic weight increased. She became not just a daughter, but the future of a narrative. Marriage to John Francis Amherst. Cecil seemed to reinforce continuity, American wealth aligning with British aristocracy. It satisfied social symmetry, but symmetry does not guarantee fulfillment. Her divorce in 1934 shocked observers because it broke alignment. Her departure from America deepened that rupture. By the time she reinvented herself in Europe, experimenting with spiritual philosophy, aura colors, and artistic expression, society labeled her eccentric. Yet what appears eccentric in isolation can look like coherence in sequence. Consider the trajectory: a near miss with disaster aboard the Titanic as a child, a father's death at 14, public scrutiny throughout adolescence, a marriage bound by tradition, motherhood under aristocratic expectation, divorce amid social pressure, transatlantic relocation, reinvention of name and appearance, survival through World War II, 2 additional marriages, final separation from ancestral burial. There is a through line: autonomy through motion. She did not stay where roles were fixed. Her later life with Vivian Francis Bulkley Johnson brought stability. After his death, her marriage to William Goodsir demonstrated that she continued choosing companionship on her own terms, even when society quietly raised eyebrows. The age difference did not deter her. Expectations did not redirect her. She no longer needed to prove independence. She simply lived it. Meanwhile, Biltmore continued solidifying into American mythology. Its National Historic Landmark status ensured institutional preservation. Tourism increased. The estate transformed into a multifaceted enterprise. Its story became fixed in brochures, plaques, guided narratives. Cornelia's story resisted that containment. She cannot be summarized in a single frame. Was she privileged? Undeniably. Was she unconventional? Certainly. Was she fleeing something? Possibly. Was she seeking something? Almost certainly. The most compelling interpretation may be the simplest. She wanted authorship. When identity is pre-written, authorship becomes the rarest luxury. Money could buy art collections, land, titles, but it could not buy self-definition. That had to be constructed. In her final years in Oxfordshire, there were no more dramatic gestures, no bold color transformations, no transatlantic headlines, just routine, conversation, reading, reflection. Sometimes reinvention culminates not in spectacle, but in quiet alignment. When she died in 1976, her cremation marked the final symbolic departure from Vanderbilt ritual. No mausoleum reunion. No American burial plot reclaiming her narrative. Her ashes remained in Britain, and later, in Scotland beside Goodsir, in death. She chose proximity to lived life rather than inherited lineage. Today, millions walk through Biltmore each year. They marvel at its scale. They photograph its halls. They absorb the story of industrial ambition turned architectural fantasy. Few pause to consider that the most radical Vanderbilt act was not building the largest private home in America. It was leaving it. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt stands as a study in contrast. Born into permanence, drawn toward fluidity, surrounded by legacy, compelled toward individuality, defined by name, driven to redefine self. If Biltmore is a monument to ambition, Cornelia is a monument to choice. And choice, unlike stone, cannot be preserved behind velvet ropes. It must be enacted. She enacted it repeatedly. That is why her story continues to unsettle easy narratives of wealth and duty. Because in the mirror of her life, we see a question that transcends dynasties. If you were handed everything, would you accept the script? Or would you rewrite it? Before she ever chose to leave it, before she ever questioned it. The Vanderbilt name was already a structure as imposing as Biltmore Estate itself. To understand Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, one must understand the machinery she was born into. The Vanderbilt fortune did not begin with elegance. It began with aggression. Her great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, built his empire in 19th century America through steamships and railroads. He was not refined. He was relentless. He consolidated routes, crushed competitors, redefined transportation infrastructure. By the time he died in 1877, he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. His descendants inherited not just money, but expectation. They translated industrial power into cultural legitimacy. Mansions rose along Fifth Avenue. Newport cottages became symbols of summer aristocracy. Art collections expanded. Titles were pursued through strategic marriages into European nobility. By the time Cornelia was born in 1900, the Vanderbilt name represented both industrial dominance and social aspiration. Her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, took a slightly different path from his siblings. Less interested in competitive display, more inclined toward intellectual cultivation. He built Biltmore in North Carolina not as a seasonal extravagance, but as a working estate, with agriculture, forestry, and architectural intention. It was America's answer to European grandeur. And Cornelia was its only child. Imagine growing up in a 250-room house designed not for intimacy, but for impression. Imagine understanding, even as a girl, that your surname carries historical gravity. Servants moved through corridors. Guests of influence visited. Expectations lingered in every formal dinner, every public appearance. Privilege often disguises pressure. When George Vanderbilt died suddenly in 1914, 14-year-old Cornelia inherited not just wealth, but symbolic continuity. Her mother, Edith, became the central authority, guiding her through adolescence amid national change. World War I reshaped global structures. Monarchies fell, old alliances fractured. Yet within Biltmore's stone walls, continuity was preserved. Cornelia's debut into society followed traditional patterns. Her 1924 wedding to John Francis Amherst Cecil merged American wealth with British aristocracy, an alliance that echoed a larger pattern among Gilded Age families seeking European legitimacy. The ceremony at Biltmore was grand. Newspapers followed every detail. The narrative was clear. The Vanderbilt heiress had fulfilled her role. But fulfillment is not the same as belonging. Marriage placed Cornelia within another structure of expectation, this time layered with British tradition. As Viscountess Cecil, she navigated diplomatic environments, aristocratic protocol, and public scrutiny across 2 continents. Motherhood followed. 2 sons were born. Appearances were maintained, on paper. The script was flawless, yet beneath the surface, tension accumulated. The 1920s and early 1930s were periods of cultural upheaval. Women gained the right to vote in the United States. Social roles subtly shifted. Modernity challenged tradition. For a woman raised within 2 of the most tradition-bound systems, American industrial aristocracy and British nobility, internal conflict was perhaps inevitable. By 1934, that tension crystallized into divorce. The separation from John Francis Amherst Cecil was not explosive by modern standards, but in its era, it carried weight. Divorce among aristocracy remained sensitive. For a Vanderbilt heiress, it signaled disruption. Cornelia could have retreated quietly to Biltmore, resumed ceremonial roles, and maintained continuity. Instead, she chose departure. She relocated permanently to Europe. This was not merely geographic movement, it was philosophical. Leaving America meant distancing herself from the physical symbol of her inheritance. It meant declining to preside over Biltmore as its central figure. It meant surrendering visibility within the Vanderbilt narrative. Many heirs cling to legacy. Cornelia loosened her grip. But to interpret this solely as rebellion misses the nuance. Consider the scale of what she stepped away from. One of the largest private homes in America, a fortune measured in industrial millions, a surname synonymous with Gilded Age dominance, a ready-made position within cultural history. Most people spend lifetimes attempting to build permanence. She was born into it and walked away. That decision reframes the way we understand wealth. Wealth can secure comfort. It can purchase access. It can construct monuments. It cannot dictate identity. Cornelia's departure did not dismantle the Vanderbilt legacy. Her sons would later ensure Biltmore's preservation and transformation into a sustainable enterprise. The estate would gain National Historic Landmark status. Tourism would flourish. The structure endured. But she did not remain inside it, and that distinction defines her story. HOI 5 begins not with spectacle, but with awareness. The awareness that the heaviest inheritance is not money. It is narrative. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt inherited a narrative centuries in the making. Her life would become the slow, deliberate act of rewriting it. When Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt left America after her divorce from John Francis Amherst Cecil in 1934, it was not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of pressure building quietly for years. To the public, her life had seemed ideal. Heiress of George Washington Vanderbilt II, mistress of Biltmore Estate, wife to British aristocracy, mother of 2 sons positioned to inherit a cultural landmark. But ideal is often a word assigned from the outside. Inside that structure, expectations operated like architecture, fixed, load-bearing, immovable. The role of a Vanderbilt daughter was not written casually. It carried assumptions of continuity, stewardship, public composure, social diplomacy, deference to lineage. Divorce disrupted that symmetry. In the early 1930s, divorce among the elite was still layered with stigma. While not unheard of, it fractured the image of stability. For an American heiress married into British nobility, the rupture felt symbolic, as if 2 systems of inherited prestige had failed to align. Cornelia could have retreated into privacy within the estate. She could have resumed a ceremonial role as the resident Vanderbilt presence at Biltmore. Her sons, George and William, were still young. The estate required a maternal anchor. Instead, she chose distance. She settled in Europe, primarily England, and began a process that, at the time, bewildered observers. She changed, not gradually, not discreetly, deliberately. She experimented with spiritual philosophy, becoming involved in movements that explored color symbolism and aura theory. She adopted the name Neeltschauer, derived from concepts within that spiritual framework. She dyed her hair vivid shades, pink, blue, defying conventional expectations of aristocratic presentation. Newspapers labeled her eccentric, but eccentricity is often simply deviation from norm. To understand her transformation, one must consider the context of the 1930s. The world was in flux. Economic depression destabilized financial hierarchies. Political extremism rose across Europe. Traditional institutions wavered in such an environment. Identity itself felt unstable. For Cornelia, whose identity had always been externally defined, instability may have offered opportunity. If everything is shifting, why not shift oneself? Her reinvention was not financially reckless. She did not squander her resources in scandal or spectacle. She maintained responsibility toward her sons. She ensured their education and stability, but she no longer allowed her personal expression to be constrained by inherited decorum. Her second marriage. In 1941, to Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson signaled another recalibration. Vivian was not aristocracy. He was a British Army officer and later a banker, respectable, stable. But outside the ornamental hierarchy of titles, their relationship was grounded less in social alignment and more in companionship. The timing was significant. World War II had engulfed Europe. Bombings disrupted London. Uncertainty defined daily life. Survival replaced ceremony. During the war, Cornelia experienced another near-fatal moment when a German air raid struck close to her residence, decades earlier. As a child, she had narrowly avoided boarding the Titanic before its catastrophic voyage, twice. History brushed against her with lethal force. Twice. She survived. Near-death experiences often alter perspective. For someone who had spent her early life navigating expectation, the randomness of survival may have clarified priorities. What is legacy worth if life itself is fragile? What is title worth under bombardment? War reduces hierarchy to vulnerability. After the war, she did not return to America to reclaim a central role at Biltmore. Instead, she remained in England with Vivian. Their life together was comparatively quiet, anchored in the Mount in the Cotswolds, while her sons increasingly took responsibility for Biltmore Estate, transforming it into a structured public institution. Cornelia pursued introspection rather than oversight. The contrast is striking. Biltmore adapted through commercialization and preservation. It professionalized. It institutionalized. Cornelia adapted through interior exploration. She deconstructed and rebuilt identity. Both were survival strategies. One preserved architecture. The other preserved autonomy. Critics at the time saw only surface irregularities: the colorful hair, the unconventional spirituality, the distance from American society. But beneath those gestures was a coherent pattern: reclaim authorship. When one is born into a script written by ancestors, rewriting it requires visible change. Subtle adjustments are easily absorbed back into tradition. Cornelia did not want absorption. She wanted separation, and separation, in her era, required bold signals. By the late 1940s and 1950s, her public eccentricities softened. The vivid hair colors faded. The name Nilchower receded. What remained was not spectacle, but a recalibrated self. She had broken the script, not through destruction, but through divergence. And once divergence becomes normalized, it no longer needs to announce itself. Her later years would be quieter, more contemplative, but the fracture she introduced into the Vanderbilt narrative could not be undone. The heiress had demonstrated something radical. Inheritance is powerful, but it is not absolute. And once that truth is lived, it cannot be unlived. By the 1950s, the most dramatic chapters of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt's transformation were behind her. The vivid hair colors had faded. The spiritual alias Nilchower receded into memory. The headlines grew less frequent. From the outside, it appeared that the Vanderbilt heiress who once startled society had quieted. But quiet does not mean retreat. It means consolidation. Her life with Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson at the Mount in the English countryside offered something she had rarely known in youth: rhythm without spectacle. The war had passed. Europe was rebuilding. Aristocratic structures had softened. Britain itself was adjusting to a post-imperial identity. In many ways, Cornelia's life mirrored that larger cultural shift. The 19th century had been about expansion and assertion. The early 20th century about dominance and display. Mid-century became about adaptation, back in North Carolina. Adaptation was precisely what her sons were implementing at Biltmore Estate. George and William recognized that survival required evolution. A 250-room mansion could not function indefinitely as a purely private residence in a democratic, economically modern nation. They professionalized operations, expanded tours, refined agricultural ventures, and laid groundwork for long-term sustainability. In 1963, Biltmore's designation as a National Historic Landmark formalized its cultural significance. The estate her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, had envisioned as a permanent statement achieved institutional permanence. It would not crumble into obscurity. It would not be sold in fragments. It would endure. And Cornelia remained absent. Her absence was not accidental. In 1958, when her mother, Edith Vanderbilt, died, Cornelia did not return to the United States for the funeral. To many observers, this decision felt final, even unforgiving. How could the only child of Biltmore's founding couple not attend her mother's burial? Speculation followed. Estrangement, emotional distance, quiet defiance. The truth was likely more complex. Returning would have meant stepping back into the gravitational field she had worked decades to exit. Funerals are not merely ceremonies. They are reunions of narrative. They pull individuals back into roles defined by lineage. Cornelia had already constructed a life outside that orbit. Her choice signaled not hostility, but boundary. She did not disown her past. She refused to re-enter it ceremonially. This distinction is critical. Throughout her life, she maintained financial responsibility and maternal commitment. Her sons remained connected to her. The Vanderbilt lineage continued through them. The estate prospered. She did not destroy continuity. She simply declined to embody it. After Vivian's death in 1968, another shift occurred. Widowhood can destabilize even carefully constructed equilibrium. Yet Cornelia did not collapse inward. Instead, she formed a new companionship with William Goodsir, marrying him in 1972. She was 72. He was 26 years younger. In earlier decades, such a union would have provoked scandal loud enough to eclipse her earlier eccentricities. But by the 1970s, cultural norms had loosened. Age differences and unconventional pairings no longer carried the same weight. Still, the marriage reinforced a pattern. Cornelia chose based on personal alignment, not public approval. She did not recalibrate decisions according to how they would reflect on the Vanderbilt name. She acted as an individual. By the time she entered her final years in Oxfordshire, her life had become almost understated. No bold gestures remained. No dramatic declarations, just the continuity of daily living. It is tempting to interpret this quiet ending as anticlimactic, especially after decades of transformation. But perhaps it represents completion. A life defined by inheritance can feel like an echo of someone else's ambition. A life redefined through choice feels authored. When Cornelia died in 1976, she chose cremation. This decision separated her permanently from the Vanderbilt Mausoleum in New York, where many members of the dynasty rested beneath monumental stone. Instead, her ashes remained in Britain. Later, they were interred alongside William Goodsir in Scotland. In death, she reaffirmed the geography of her chosen life. Not America's industrial corridors, not Biltmore's carved limestone, but the English countryside she had inhabited for decades. Distance without disappearance. That phrase may define her legacy best. She did not vanish. She did not self-destruct. She did not sever lineage. She created space. Space between herself and expectation. Space between surname and identity. Space between monument and self. Today, as millions continue to tour Biltmore each year, they encounter preserved rooms and curated narratives. They learn about the Vanderbilt fortune, the architectural vision, the transformation into a historic landmark. Cornelia appears within that narrative, but not as its center, and perhaps that is fitting. Because her life was not about centering herself within inherited grandeur. It was about stepping slightly to the side, far enough to breathe, far enough to choose, far enough to exist as more than an heiress. In doing so, she demonstrated something subtle but enduring. You can belong to history without allowing history to own you. There is a quiet thread running through the life of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt that is easy to overlook. Twice, history moved toward catastrophe. Twice, she stood near its edge. Twice, she survived. The first time, she was barely 12 years old. In April 1912, the Vanderbilt family had planned to return to America aboard the RMS Titanic. At the last moment, plans changed. Her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, chose an earlier ship. Days later, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank into the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 lives were lost. Among the dead were some of the wealthiest and most prominent families of the era, names that had defined American high society. The disaster did not discriminate between ambition and anonymity. Had schedules remained unchanged, Cornelia's childhood might have ended in icy darkness. Instead, she returned safely to Biltmore Estate. It is impossible to measure the psychological impact of near-miss tragedy on a child. But survival, when juxtaposed against massive loss, leaves residue. The world is not stable. Fortune does not guarantee safety. Legacy cannot negotiate with ice. 2 years later. In 1914, her father died unexpectedly from complications following surgery. She was 14. The second brush with disaster did not come from the sea, but from the sky, during World War II. While living in England after her divorce from John Francis Amherst Cecil, Cornelia endured the bombing campaigns that targeted British cities. German air raids shattered buildings, erased neighborhoods, reduced centuries-old structures to rubble. At one point, a bomb fell close enough to threaten her residence. Again, proximity to annihilation. Again, survival. What does it mean to live through events that could have erased you? Some individuals respond with caution, clinging tighter to stability. Others respond with urgency, reevaluating what truly matters. In Cornelia's case, survival did not draw her back toward inherited permanence. It pushed her further toward personal authorship. Consider the contrast. Her great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, built his fortune on expansion and consolidation. His legacy was infrastructure, steel rails, steamship routes, economic power. Her father built Biltmore, stone, gardens, permanence against the Appalachian landscape. Cornelia survived disasters that exposed the fragility of all permanence. Ships sink, empires fall, cities burn. If catastrophe can arrive without warning, perhaps identity must be lived deliberately rather than deferred. After World War II, Europe entered a period of reconstruction. Britain, once the center of global empire, confronted diminished power. Aristocratic traditions softened, class boundaries blurred. The world Cornelia had once married into no longer looked the same, and neither did she. Her second marriage to Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson brought a decade and a half of relative calm. It was a partnership grounded less in ceremony and more in companionship, but beneath that calm lay accumulated awareness. She had seen how quickly stability could fracture. The Titanic had represented ultimate confidence in modern engineering. Unsinkable, newspapers proclaimed. It sank anyway. European aristocracy had seemed permanent for centuries. War fractured it. American industrial dynasties once appeared unassailable. The Great Depression humbled many. Perhaps. Then, her decision to detach from the gravitational pull of Biltmore was not eccentricity. Perhaps it was clarity. If permanence is illusion, then choice becomes the only reliable constant. Her life illustrates this tension repeatedly. She did not reject wealth because she despised it. She did not abandon Biltmore because she wished it destroyed. She simply refused to anchor her identity to structures that history had proven fragile. Ironically, Biltmore endured under the stewardship of her sons. It transitioned into a sustainable public institution. It gained National Historic Landmark status. Tourism flourished. The estate adapted to modernity. The house survived the century. But its survival does not negate the lesson of vulnerability. Cornelia's survival stories. Titanic avoided. Bombing endured. Function almost like narrative punctuation. They interrupt assumptions. They remind us that legacy is not immunity, and perhaps they illuminate her most radical act. Choosing self-definition in a world that repeatedly demonstrated unpredictability. Some individuals, when confronted with mortality, cling to monument. Others step away from it. Cornelia stepped away, not in panic, not in chaos, but with deliberate, steady movement across decades. She survived history's violence, and then chose not to be defined by inherited permanence. That is not rebellion. It is awareness, and awareness, once awakened, cannot be silenced. For all the attention given to her reinventions, her marriages, her departures, one question lingers quietly beneath the surface of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt's story. What kind of mother was she? History often reduces her to spectacle. The heiress who dyed her hair pink. The Vanderbilt who left America. But between those headlines were two boys growing up in the shadow of expectation. George and William Cecil were born into dual inheritance, American industrial wealth and British aristocracy, through their father. John Francis Amherst Cecil. They carried a title. Through their mother. They carried the Vanderbilt legacy, and with it, the future of Biltmore Estate. When Cornelia divorced in 1934 and relocated permanently to Europe, the arrangement of custody and residence reflected the complexities of transatlantic aristocracy. Her sons maintained strong ties to Biltmore and eventually returned to North Carolina as young adults to assume leadership roles at the estate. From a distance, this can appear as abandonment, but distance is not always absence. Correspondence between Cornelia and her sons suggests continued communication, continued concern. She ensured their education. She did not sever contact. She did not disappear from their lives. What she relinquished was proximity to the estate, not motherhood itself. Still, it is impossible to ignore the emotional geometry of the situation. Her sons would become the primary stewards of the mansion their grandfather built. They would professionalize its operations, oversee its preservation, and guide its transformation into a modern enterprise. Their lives became intertwined with the estate's survival. Cornelia, meanwhile, lived in England, constructing identity separate from that architecture. Imagine the contrast. Two sons walking daily through the halls of Biltmore, learning to manage its finances, its staff, its public image. Their mother walking English countryside, engaging in spiritual inquiry, later settling into quiet domesticity. Parallel lives connected by blood, but shaped by different gravitational pulls. When George and William began modernizing Biltmore's operations mid-century, they faced pragmatic challenges. Maintenance costs were immense. Public interest needed cultivation. The estate required structured tourism to remain solvent. They approached stewardship with discipline. In many ways, they fulfilled precisely the role history expected from the Vanderbilt line: preserve the monument, adapt it for survival, maintain the name. Cornelia had once been expected to embody that role. Instead, she created space for them to do so. There is an argument, subtle but compelling, that her departure may have allowed Biltmore's transformation to proceed without internal conflict. Had she remained at the estate, her identity might have been permanently tied to its ceremonial function. As the visible Vanderbilt presence, She would have been expected to preside over tours, represent continuity, embody nostalgia. Her sons, then young men forming professional identities, might have operated under her shadow. By removing herself geographically, she eliminated that dynamic. They became primary decision makers. They modernized. They stabilized. Biltmore endured. The narrative of abandonment simplifies this complexity. Cornelia did not contest their leadership. She did not impose ideological resistance. She did not attempt to reclaim authority. She stepped aside, and stepping aside can be an act of trust. Her absence from her mother Edith's funeral in 1958 is often cited as the most painful symbol of distance. But relationships are rarely visible from the outside in full dimension. Emotional history cannot be reconstructed solely from public action. What can be observed is continuity. Her sons remained connected to her. The Vanderbilt bloodline continued at Biltmore. The estate did not fracture into internal dispute. In fact, it stabilized. This suggests that, whatever private tensions existed, functional bridges remained intact. As the decades progressed and Cornelia entered later life with Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson, and later with William Goodsir, her sons' professional responsibilities deepened in America. They were not estranged heirs. They were engaged stewards, and they carried forward the legacy their grandfather envisioned. If one examines Cornelia's life through the lens of motherhood rather than spectacle, a different interpretation emerges. She refused to bind her sons to her personal rebellion. She did not demand they follow her to Europe. She did not attempt to dismantle their connection to Biltmore. She allowed them to inhabit the role she had declined. In doing so, she preserved both autonomy and continuity. It is a delicate balance. Many who reject inherited identity inadvertently disrupt generational cohesion. Cornelia's path suggests something more nuanced. She redefined herself, without dismantling the structure her sons would maintain. Today, when visitors tour Biltmore, they encounter a living enterprise. Descendants remain involved. The estate continues evolving. That evolution owes as much to the sons who stayed as to the mother who left. One preserved stone, the other preserved self. And between them, the Vanderbilt narrative expanded beyond a single script. Cornelia's motherhood may never be as photogenic as the mansion she departed, but it is woven quietly into its survival. Because sometimes the most radical act is not walking away alone. It is walking away without pulling everything else down with you. By the late 1960s, two parallel legacies were firmly established in North Carolina. Biltmore Estate had completed its transformation from private aristocratic residence into a sustainable public institution. Under the leadership of Cornelia's sons, the estate no longer depended solely on inherited wealth. It functioned as a business, a landmark, a carefully managed cultural enterprise in England. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt lived as something entirely different from what her birth had prescribed. The contrast was no longer dramatic. It was structural. The estate represented continuity through adaptation. Cornelia represented identity through separation. Neither failed, neither collapsed. Both endured, but on different terms. After the death of Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson in 1968, Cornelia faced widowhood again. She had already outlived the world that shaped her childhood. The Gilded Age grandeur, the illusion of unsinkable ships, the rigid hierarchy of aristocracy before 2 world wars destabilized it. She had survived the Titanic's shadow. She had survived European bombing campaigns. She had survived divorce in an era that discouraged it. She had survived public scrutiny. Now she entered the final decade of her life in a world that looked radically different from the one into which she was born. The 1970s were defined by cultural fluidity. Traditional authority was questioned. Individualism intensified. Social norms relaxed. In many ways, society had moved closer to the ethos she had embodied decades earlier. When she married William Goodsir in 1972, 26 years her junior, it barely registered as scandal. What once might have caused outrage now seemed unremarkable. Time had caught up with her choices. Meanwhile, Biltmore stood unchanged in form, but altered in function. The house, her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, envisioned as a personal estate, had become a shared experience. Visitors filled its halls. Preservation experts maintained its architecture. Marketing teams promoted seasonal events. The private had become public. Ironically, the mansion became more accessible precisely as its original inhabitants withdrew from daily life within it. Cornelia did not participate in that evolution directly. She did not oversee renovations. She did not attend landmark ceremonies. She did not reinsert herself into its narrative as a matriarchal figure. She remained an exile by choice, but exile implies rejection. Her story suggests something subtler: repositioning. Exile forced by politics carries bitterness. Exile chosen for autonomy carries clarity. Cornelia's life in England was not marked by financial hardship or social isolation. She maintained relationships, engaged intellectually, and lived with deliberate modesty relative to her origins. She did not attempt to recreate Biltmore in miniature abroad. She did not surround herself with American nostalgia. She allowed the estate to exist without her. And in doing so, she disentangled identity from architecture. When she died in 1976 in Oxfordshire, her passing did not trigger a dramatic reclamation by the Vanderbilt dynasty. There was no ceremonial return to American soil, no grand funeral procession beneath Biltmore's towering facade. She was cremated. Later, her ashes were placed beside William Goodsir in Scotland. Her final resting place lay firmly within the geography of her chosen life, not her inherited one. Meanwhile, Biltmore continued receiving visitors. The estate did not falter in her absence. The Vanderbilt name did not fade. The lineage persisted through her descendants. The structure endured. And yet, her absence became part of its mythology. Visitors often ask, why did the heiress leave? Why did she never come back? Why did she choose burial far from North Carolina? The answers resist simplification. Because her life was not about rejection of wealth, it was not about scandal, it was not about dramatic rupture, it was about authorship. Biltmore is fixed, stone. Gardens, carved wood. Cornelia was fluid. Choices, reinventions, boundaries. One could argue that both represent forms of resilience. The estate adapted economically and culturally to survive the 20th century. Cornelia adapted psychologically and personally to survive it. One preserved a dynasty. The other preserved autonomy. Their coexistence challenges a common assumption: that legacy demands confinement. Cornelia demonstrated that legacy can persist even when the individual steps outside its walls. Today, the Vanderbilt name remains associated with grandeur, wealth, American industrial history. Biltmore stands as its most visible monument. But alongside that monument lives a quieter legacy, the legacy of a woman who inherited permanence and chose movement. The estate and the exile, stone and motion, continuity and divergence. Both are now inseparable chapters in the same story. And neither diminishes the other. Because history is not only built by those who stay, it is also shaped by those who leave. By the time the 1970s settled into their cultural rhythm, two forces that once seemed opposed had quietly reconciled. On one side stood Biltmore Estate, stone, gardens, archives, preservation committees, tourism infrastructure. On the other stood Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, movement, reinvention, distance, authorship. For decades, her life appeared to contradict the monument she was born to inherit. But distance has a way of revealing patterns that proximity cannot. Biltmore's survival in the 20th century was not accidental. It required innovation. It required departure from the original model of aristocratic isolation. It required opening gates that had once symbolized exclusivity. In essence, the estate had to reinvent itself. So did she. When her sons expanded public tours and diversified estate operations mid-century, they were not preserving the past exactly as it had been. They were modifying it to ensure longevity. They introduced structured visitor experiences. They refined agricultural initiatives. They positioned Biltmore as both historical landmark and economic enterprise. Permanence required flexibility. Similarly, Cornelia's life, often framed as deviation, followed a consistent principle: identity must evolve to survive. Her early reinventions, the spiritual alias, the colorful hair, the transatlantic relocation, were bold gestures, but her later years reflected something subtler. After the death of Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson in 1968, and her subsequent marriage to William Goodsir in 1972, she did not seek spectacle. There were no public declarations of independence, no dramatic departures left to stage. Reinvention had matured into alignment. She had nothing left to prove. The young heiress, who once carried the burden of Vanderbilt continuity, had transformed into a woman comfortable with geographic and emotional distance from that burden. What remains striking is that her departure did not weaken the estate's long-term stability. In fact, the opposite occurred. Freed from serving as a living symbol of inherited grandeur, Biltmore could reposition itself as cultural heritage rather than private dynasty. Its National Historic Landmark designation in 1963 formalized this shift. The house no longer required a Vanderbilt heiress presiding in its halls to justify its significance. It stood on architectural and historical merit. Cornelia, meanwhile, stood on personal autonomy. The two legacies no longer competed. They coexisted. In the decades following her death in 1976, public interest in Vanderbilt history deepened. Scholars revisited the Gilded Age. Biographers examined the rise and fragmentation of industrial dynasties. Cultural historians reassessed the meaning of inherited wealth in modern democracies. Within that broader context, Cornelia's life gained new resonance. In earlier decades, she had been labeled eccentric. Later, she was reconsidered as ahead of her time. Modern audiences, living in an era that values reinvention, relocation, and self-authorship, often view her decisions with greater empathy than her contemporaries did. The 21st century understands fluid identity. It understands departure from inherited expectation. It understands geographic independence. Cornelia practiced those principles in the 1930s and 1940s. When such choices required far greater social risk, her refusal to return for her mother's funeral in 1958, once interpreted harshly, can now be read as boundary setting. Her marriages outside rigid aristocratic alignment appear less scandalous and more human. Time softens judgment, and time clarifies intention. It becomes evident that she did not seek to dismantle the Vanderbilt name. She did not publish memoirs condemning aristocracy. She did not publicly criticize her upbringing. She did not campaign against inherited wealth. She simply chose not to let it script her life. Meanwhile, Biltmore continued adapting, introducing seasonal events, expanding hospitality offerings, investing in long-term preservation strategies. Visitors who walk through its grand halls today experience a curated version of permanence. They see carved fireplaces, tapestries, towering ceilings. They absorb narratives of ambition and artistry. Few sense the internal struggle of the only child who once moved through those corridors under the weight of expectation. But that struggle shaped the estate's story as surely as any architectural blueprint. Because without Cornelia's departure, Biltmore might have remained locked within a narrower narrative, a private monument clinging to obsolete aristocratic identity. Her absence accelerated evolution, and evolution ensured endurance. Reinventing permanence sounds paradoxical, but both the mansion and the heiress accomplished it. The estate reinvented how permanence functions, from exclusivity to accessibility. Cornelia reinvented what permanence means, not a fixed identity, but a self-chosen repeatedly across decades. By the time she died in Oxfordshire, cremated and later interred beside William Goodsir in Scotland, her life no longer appeared fragmented. It appeared intentional, born into permanence, tested by catastrophe, tempted by tradition, freed by distance, and finally, settled not in stone, but in self-definition. HOI 7 begins where tension fades and perspective sharpens. Because sometimes the most radical story is not the one of collapse or scandal. It is the story of someone who quietly proves that legacy and freedom are not mutually exclusive if one is willing to redraw their boundaries. History has a habit of simplifying people. It prefers clean arcs, clear villains, clear heroes, clear cautionary tales. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt does not fit comfortably into any of those categories, and so history often trims her. In many popular retellings of the Vanderbilt dynasty, the focus remains on industrial conquest, on Cornelius Vanderbilt and the explosive rise of railroads and steamships. The narrative then moves to architectural grandeur, to George Washington Vanderbilt II and the creation of Biltmore Estate. Cornelia appears briefly, a daughter, an heiress, a society bride. Then, almost abruptly, she becomes the eccentric who left. It is a convenient storyline, but convenience rarely captures complexity. What history often prefers is the image of Biltmore as uninterrupted continuity, industrial wealth crystallized into architecture, preserved by dutiful descendants, admired by millions, a stable arc. Cornelia complicates that arc. She introduces rupture, not catastrophic rupture, but narrative disruption. She proves that inheritance does not guarantee compliance, that a person can step outside dynasty without destroying it. This nuance makes her harder to categorize. Was she rebellious? Yes, but not destructively so. Was she privileged? Undeniably. Yet privilege did not cage her imagination. Was she irresponsible? Evidence suggests otherwise. The estate survived. Her sons thrived. Lineage continued. She did not implode the structure she left. She refused to inhabit it. Modern historians increasingly recognize that this distinction matters. In the early 20th century, women born into elite families were expected to embody stability. They served as visual confirmation that wealth translated into moral and social order. Divorce, relocation, public reinvention. These destabilized the image. Cornelia destabilized the image. But images are not the same as institutions. The institution, Biltmore, endured. Under the stewardship of her sons, it transitioned into an economic and cultural enterprise. Its National Historic Landmark designation in 1963 anchored it firmly within American heritage. Tourism expanded. Preservation initiatives modernized. The estate did not need Cornelia to stand inside it to justify its existence. It needed management, strategy, adaptation. It received those from the next generation. History prefers to attribute Biltmore's survival solely to practical stewardship. But one might argue that Cornelia's departure indirectly strengthened that stewardship. Without a resident Vanderbilt heiress embodying nostalgic aristocracy, the estate was freer to reposition itself as a public institution rather than a private relic. Her absence simplified operational clarity. The mansion could evolve without emotional entanglement. Meanwhile, Cornelia's life unfolded beyond American expectation. Her second marriage to Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson anchored her in England during the turbulence of World War II. Her third marriage to William Goodsir in 1972 signaled that even in her 70s, she continued choosing companionship on her own terms. These choices rarely appear in standard Vanderbilt overviews. Why? Because they resist dynasty-centered framing. They center the individual. And dynasty narratives are uncomfortable when individuals step outside their gravitational pull. Yet that tension is precisely what makes her story enduring. Visitors walking through Biltmore today encounter curated rooms, preserved dining halls, libraries, bedrooms. They are guided through a narrative emphasizing ambition, architecture, cultural refinement. Few tour scripts dwell extensively on the heiress who permanently relocated across the Atlantic. It is easier to focus on building than departure, but departure shapes legacy just as profoundly as construction. Cornelia's story invites a broader reflection on inherited identity. In industrial America, legacy was measured in expansion. More railroads, more property, larger houses. In the 20th century, legacy began shifting toward preservation, maintaining what was built. Cornelia added a third dimension: redefinition. She neither expanded nor preserved Biltmore personally. She redefined what it meant to be its heiress. Her cremation in 1976 and subsequent interment in Scotland beside William Goodsir reinforced that redefinition. She did not return to the Vanderbilt Mausoleum in New York. She did not symbolically rejoin the American industrial lineage in death. She remained aligned with the life she chose. History sometimes prefers endings that circle back neatly to origins. Cornelia did not circle back, and that unsettles tidy storytelling. But perhaps the discomfort is the point, because her life challenges a persistent assumption that legacy must be lived in proximity. Cornelia demonstrated otherwise. You can inherit a monument and choose not to reside within it. You can love family and still draw boundaries. You can carry a famous name without allowing it to define your geography. The story history prefers is one of seamless continuity, wealth to architecture to preservation. Cornelia's story adds texture to that continuity. She is the reminder that behind monuments are individuals, and individuals are not stone. They move, they question, they survive, they choose, and sometimes they leave without breaking what they leave behind. Strip away the mansion, strip away the surname, strip away the mythology of American industrial wealth. What remains of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt? This is where her story becomes most interesting. Because once you remove Biltmore Estate from the frame, once you step outside the shadow of George Washington Vanderbilt II and the industrial force of Cornelius Vanderbilt, you are left with something far less monumental and far more human. A girl who lost her father at 14. A young woman married into expectation. A mother navigating 2 continents. A survivor of global catastrophe. A widow more than once. A woman aging in a world that had transformed beyond recognition. The Vanderbilt name tends to freeze people into symbols. Wealth, ambition, dynasty. But Cornelia's life resists that freezing. If Biltmore represents stone permanence, she represents motion through time. Consider how dramatically the world changed across her lifetime. She was born in 1900 when the United States stood on the brink of industrial supremacy. Horses still outnumbered automobiles. Aristocracy, both American and European, still commanded social deference. By the time she died in 1976, humanity had walked on the moon. 2 world wars had redrawn global borders. Empires had collapsed. Social revolutions had dismantled rigid hierarchies. The world she inherited did not survive intact. Why should her identity have remained fixed? When she experimented with spiritual movements and aura philosophy in the 1930s, critics called her eccentric, but that decade was defined by instability, economic depression, ideological extremism, social fragmentation. Spiritual searching was not uncommon. It was simply more scrutinized when undertaken by someone carrying a famous name. When she dyed her hair unconventional colors, it was framed as rebellion. But rebellion implies anger. There is little evidence of anger in her later life. What appears instead is exploration of self outside of inherited architecture. It is easy to imagine that such exploration was indulgent, a luxury afforded by wealth. And perhaps it was, but wealth does not eliminate vulnerability. She narrowly avoided the Titanic. She endured wartime bombings in England. She lost loved ones. She experienced divorce when stigma still clung to it. Money cannot insulate against mortality. It cannot guarantee emotional alignment. It cannot prevent loneliness. By the time she entered her later years, after the death of Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson and her marriage to William Goodsir, Cornelia was no longer the heiress shocking American society. She was an aging woman choosing companionship. There is something quietly powerful in that. She did not retreat into isolation. She did not perform nostalgia. She did not attempt to reclaim the spotlight of her youth. She lived, and living, when stripped of spectacle, is rarely dramatic. Meanwhile, Biltmore continued receiving millions of visitors. The estate's operations expanded. Hospitality programs developed. Agricultural initiatives evolved. It became both memory and enterprise. The house stands today as one of America's most visited historic homes. But the woman who once ran through its halls cannot be fully captured within its tour script. Because she refused to be architecture, she chose to be narrative. Narrative shifts. Narrative adapts. Narrative resists confinement. Her decision not to return for her mother's funeral in 1958 remains one of the most debated moments of her life. But perhaps it reflects something simple. She had already mourned what Biltmore represented in her youth. Returning physically would not restore what time had altered. Sometimes closure happens internally long before ceremony. When she died in 1976 in Oxfordshire, cremated and later interred in Scotland beside William Goodsir, she completed a life arc defined not by return, but by relocation. She began in America's grandest private home. The woman behind the name was not A. The woman behind the name was not a scandal. She was not a footnote. She was a study in choice, in a dynasty built on accumulation. She accumulated experience instead, in a family defined by monuments. She defined herself through movement, and perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate, because in every generation, there are individuals born into expectation, family expectation, cultural expectation, economic expectation. Most comply, some collapse. A few redraw the boundary. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt redrew it quietly, steadily. Across decades, the mansion still stands. The dynasty still echoes. But the woman who walked away from both ensured that the Vanderbilt legacy would include something beyond stone. It would include the possibility of choosing oneself. By the time the late 20th century settled into memory, Biltmore Estate had fully transformed from private dynasty residence into public experience. Visitors arrived in steady streams. They moved through vast corridors, past carved fireplaces and vaulted ceilings, listening to carefully constructed narratives about ambition, refinement, and legacy. They heard the story of George Washington Vanderbilt II and his vision. They learned about the industrial power of Cornelia Vanderbilt. They saw photographs of a poised young heiress, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, standing at the center of American aristocracy, and then, often briefly, they were told, "She left." That sentence carries more weight than it appears to, because when a monument survives and the heir departs, the monument becomes a mirror. Biltmore reflects ambition, preservation, and institutional continuity. Cornelia reflects departure, reinvention, and personal autonomy. The estate is curated certainty. Her life is evolving ambiguity. As decades passed after her death in 1976, public interest in dynastic families deepened. Biographers revisited Gilded Age wealth. Cultural critics examined the rise and decline of industrial empires. The Vanderbilt name remained embedded in American consciousness, but interpretations shifted in earlier eras. Cornelia had been portrayed as eccentric, a socialite who drifted into mysticism and abandoned responsibility. Later scholarship became more nuanced. Historians began asking different questions. What does it mean to inherit overwhelming expectation? What psychological weight accompanies singular privilege? What forms of rebellion are possible when rebellion risks destabilizing a dynasty? Through that lens, her departure from Biltmore no longer appears reckless. It appears strategic. She did not publicly denounce her family. She did not litigate for financial control. She did not attempt to sell or dismantle the estate. She stepped away and allowed the institution to evolve. Her sons assumed stewardship. They professionalized operations, ensuring Biltmore's economic sustainability. The estate's National Historic Landmark status reinforced its historical importance over time. The property expanded its hospitality and agricultural enterprises. In short, Biltmore modernized, and in doing so, it mirrored her own trajectory. Because modernity was precisely what Cornelia embraced decades earlier, not technologically, but psychologically. When she relocated permanently to Europe after divorcing John Francis Amherst Cecil, she stepped outside a rigid script. When she later married Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson, and eventually William Goodsir, she chose companionship independent of aristocratic alignment. Her life ceased to revolve around validating inherited prestige. Instead, it revolved around self-direction. This is where the metaphor of the mirror deepens. Visitors walking through Biltmore today often imagine permanence. The stone seems immovable. The tapestries appear untouched by time. The narrative feels stable, but the very existence of public tours signals adaptation. The estate survives not because it remained frozen, but because it changed. It opened its gates. It commercialized access. It embraced heritage tourism. Permanence, it turns out, requires evolution. Cornelia understood that principle intuitively. Her reinventions were not erratic disruptions. They were evolutionary responses to changing internal and external landscapes. She survived 2 world wars. She witnessed the collapse of aristocratic certainty. She watched industrial wealth redistribute across generations. Remaining static would have meant suffocation. Movement meant survival. And perhaps that is why. Decades later, her story resonates more strongly than it once did. In the 21st century, identity is fluid, careers shift, geography changes. Reinvention is celebrated rather than condemned. Cornelia practiced reinvention when it was risky. She absorbed criticism quietly. She allowed time to reinterpret her, and time did. Today, she is less frequently described as unstable or scandalous. She is more often framed as independent, self-directed, ahead of her era. The house became a mirror. Biltmore reflects the endurance of structure through adaptation. Cornelia reflects the endurance of self through transformation. Neither collapsed. Neither vanished. Both stand, one in stone, the other in narrative. And perhaps that is the most compelling aspect of her legacy. She did not defeat inheritance. She reframed it. Inheritance can be physical. Land, buildings, wealth. It can also be psychological. Expectation, role, identity. She inherited both. She preserved the first by stepping away. She redefined the second by rewriting herself. When visitors leave Biltmore, they often carry photographs, evidence of grandeur. Few realize they have also walked through the silent imprint of a woman who proved that legacy does not require confinement. The mansion stands as testament to what her father built. Her life stands as testament to what she refused to be limited by. And together, they tell a story far richer than either could alone. There was a time when every shift in Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt's life invited speculation. Her 1924 wedding to John Francis Amherst Cecil filled columns with descriptions of gowns and guests. Her 1934 divorce carried undertones of aristocratic rupture. Her move to Europe stirred curiosity. Her spiritual experiments and colorful self-reinvention invited raised eyebrows. But eventually, the headlines stopped, and what remained was silence. Silence is rarely examined in historical narratives, yet silence can reveal as much as spectacle. By the 1960s and 1970s, Cornelia no longer generated transatlantic intrigue. She was no longer the young heiress redefining social norms. She had aged beyond the appetite of gossip. Meanwhile, Biltmore Estate was gaining a different kind of attention. Institutional, economic, cultural. As tourism expanded across the United States, historic properties became destinations rather than relics. Biltmore positioned itself at the forefront of that movement. Seasonal events, curated exhibitions, agricultural ventures. The estate evolved into a multifaceted enterprise. Visitors came not for scandal, but for experience. And in that transition, the Vanderbilt story shifted tone. The dynasty became heritage. The heiress became history. Cornelia's life in England during her final decade was not marked by dramatic gestures. After the death of Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson and her later marriage to William Goodsir, she lived without attempting to reclaim public identity. There were no memoirs written to justify her departure, no public interviews reframing her narrative, no theatrical return to North Carolina for symbolic reconciliation. She allowed interpretation to unfold without interference. This silence is telling. Many individuals born into fame attempt to manage their legacy aggressively, shaping how they are remembered. Cornelia did not. She did not correct critics. She did not clarify motives. She did not seek final approval. She lived privately and let the mansion speak for itself. Perhaps this was her final act of autonomy. Because when one stops performing identity for public consumption, identity becomes internal in America. Her sons continued strengthening Biltmore's foundation. Their management ensured that the estate would not collapse under maintenance costs or cultural irrelevance. The mansion's status as a National Historic Landmark reinforced its legitimacy. The structure endured, not as a nostalgic relic, but as a living institution. And in that endurance, a quiet reconciliation occurred. Cornelia's absence did not diminish Biltmore's power. Biltmore's survival did not invalidate her departure. The two narratives no longer competed. They simply coexisted. It is tempting to frame her life as a dramatic arc: birth into grandeur, rebellion, exile, unconventional marriages, distant burial. But the truer arc may be subtler. She moved from public symbol to private person. In youth, she was photographed, discussed, analyzed. In age, she was simply a woman living in Oxfordshire. There is dignity in that transition. A dynasty demands visibility. An individual sometimes demands invisibility. Cornelia chose invisibility in her later years, not as retreat, but as resolution. When she died in 1976 and was cremated, her final separation from the Vanderbilt mausoleum was quiet. There was no transatlantic ceremony reclaiming her as prodigal daughter. Her ashes remained aligned with the life she had built abroad. Time, as it always does, softened judgment. By the late 20th century, historians and cultural observers began re-examining women of the Gilded Age and their descendants through more nuanced frameworks. Agency replaced scandal in interpretation. Autonomy replaced eccentricity. Cornelia's earlier silence allowed that reinterpretation to emerge organically. Had she fought publicly for her version of events, the narrative might have remained polarized. Instead, it matured. Today, when scholars analyze her life, they often situate her within broader conversations about female autonomy in elite families, the psychological weight of inherited wealth, and the shifting expectations of the 20th century. Her silence became space for deeper analysis. Meanwhile, Biltmore continues welcoming over 1 million visitors annually. It thrives as both cultural artifact and commercial enterprise. Its survival validates the stewardship of her sons, and indirectly, the structural room her departure created. The silence after the headlines was not emptiness. It was equilibrium. The heiress who once disrupted expectation settled into personal steadiness. The mansion that once symbolized private grandeur stabilized into public heritage. Neither demanded the other's presence to endure, and perhaps that is the final evolution of their relationship. They began inseparable, daughter and estate bound by birth. They ended independent, monument and woman standing on separate continents, each sustained in different ways. History often celebrates noise, but sometimes it is the quiet chapter that completes the story. Cornelia Vanderbilt's life did not end with spectacle. It ended with stillness. And in that stillness, the narrative she spent decades reshaping finally rested, not in stone, but in choice. Every dynasty has a defining gesture. For the Vanderbilts, it was expansion, railroads crossing states, steamships dominating waterways, mansions rising along Fifth Avenue, and finally, Biltmore Estate, America's largest private home, carved into the hills of North Carolina by George Washington Vanderbilt II, heir to the empire forged by Cornelius Vanderbilt. Expansion defined the family, until Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt made a different gesture. She contracted, not financially, not emotionally, but geographically and symbolically. She reduced proximity to power. She stepped away from the epicenter of inherited grandeur, and that contraction echoes louder than expansion, because building monuments is expected in dynasties. Leaving them is not. By the time Cornelia died in 1976, the world had already begun reevaluating what legacy meant. The 20th century dismantled the assumption that wealth guaranteed permanence. Empires dissolved. Aristocracies faded. Old money fractured across generations. Biltmore survived, but not unchanged. It survived because it adapted. It opened itself to public access. It embraced commercial sustainability. It transformed exclusivity into experience. In that transformation, It mirrored the broader democratization of American culture, and in her own way, Cornelia mirrored it too. She democratized herself. She removed the invisible crown. She stopped performing inherited superiority. Her marriages after divorcing John Francis Amherst Cecil were not strategic alliances. Her union with Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson reflected companionship rather than aristocratic calculus. Her later marriage to William Goodsir in her 70s ignored expectations of age and status. She no longer selected roles based on how they sustained a dynasty. She selected them based on how they sustained herself. That distinction is subtle, but radical, because for centuries, heirs were expected to reinforce lineage above all else. Cornelia did not sabotage lineage. She simply declined to prioritize it over identity. When she chose cremation rather than burial in the Vanderbilt mausoleum, the symbolism was unmistakable. She did not rejoin the monumental narrative in death. She remained aligned with the life she had authored abroad. Her ashes, placed first in England and later in Scotland beside William Goodsir, affirmed geographic and emotional autonomy. And yet, the dynasty endured. Her sons ensured Biltmore's financial stability. Descendants remain involved in its management. The estate welcomes millions each year. The Vanderbilt name persists within American historical memory. Her departure did not fracture continuity. It expanded its meaning. Legacy, her life suggests, does not require uniform participation. A dynasty can contain both preservation and departure. A monument can stand even when its heir walks away. What makes her story endure is not scandal, nor eccentricity, nor rebellion. It is the simplicity of the choice. She was born into one of the most visible fortunes in American history. She could have remained its symbol. She chose not to. That choice echoes because it challenges a universal tension: inheritance versus individuality. Most people inherit something: expectations, cultural roles, family narratives. The scale may differ, but the pressure feels familiar. Cornelia's inheritance was simply magnified. Her response was human. She sought space. She sought authorship. She sought alignment between outer life and inner conviction, and she did so without destroying what she left behind. That is perhaps her most understated accomplishment. Rebellion often scorches. Her departure did not. It redirected. Today, visitors walking through Biltmore stand beneath ceilings designed for permanence. They admire art collected for refinement. They listen to guides narrate industrial triumph. But somewhere within those walls is an absence. The absence of the only child who did not remain to preside over it. That absence is not emptiness. It is testimony. Testimony that identity is not architecture. Testimony that wealth does not negate agency. Testimony that legacy can survive divergence. The choice she made decades ago continues to ripple quietly through how we understand dynasties. Not as cages, but as starting points. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt did not dismantle Biltmore. She redefined what it meant to inherit it, and in doing so, she ensured that the Vanderbilt story would include not only ambition carved in stone, but freedom carried across oceans. Long after her death in 1976, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt continued to exist in a peculiar space, not fully central to the Vanderbilt legend, yet impossible to erase from it, because the Vanderbilt name itself never faded. In the American imagination, it still evokes the Gilded Age, excess, ambition, architectural grandeur. It calls back to Cornelius Vanderbilt consolidating railroads and steamship lines. It conjures images of Fifth Avenue mansions and Newport cottages. It culminates physically in Biltmore Estate, the monumental creation of George Washington Vanderbilt II, in this collective memory. The Vanderbilts represent ascent, but ascent stories rarely dwell on divergence, and Cornelia represents divergence. As the late 20th and early 21st centuries reshaped how Americans think about wealth, power, and inheritance, the Vanderbilt narrative shifted from admiration to analysis. Scholars began questioning not only how fortunes were built, but how they were sustained or dissipated. Some branches of the Vanderbilt family experienced dramatic financial decline over generations. Lavish lifestyles outpaced revenue streams. Estates were sold, mansions demolished, Biltmore, however, remained intact. That distinction matters. The survival of Biltmore reframed the Vanderbilt story as one of strategic adaptation rather than inevitable collapse, under the leadership of Cornelia's sons and their descendants. The estate diversified operations, expanded tourism, and professionalized management. The house became an economic engine, and in that engine, Cornelia's absence became part of the narrative. Because unlike other heirs who attempted to cling to Gilded Age grandeur as cultural tides shifted, she did not attempt to preserve the illusion of aristocratic permanence. She stepped away before nostalgia hardened into denial. In that sense, her decision appears almost prescient. The 20th century dismantled rigid hierarchies. The idea of inherited social superiority lost moral authority. Democratic values, civil rights movements, feminist discourse, all chipped away at the unquestioned prestige of dynastic wealth. Had Cornelia remained at Biltmore as a ceremonial matriarch, she might have been forced to reconcile that inherited prestige with a rapidly democratizing society. Instead, she relocated to Europe and quietly authored a life independent of American industrial mythology. Her marriages after divorcing John Francis Amherst Cecil further distanced her from strategic alliance politics. Her union with Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson was not about consolidating dynasties. Her later marriage to William Goodsir reflected companionship beyond age expectation or social calculus. These choices aligned more closely with emerging 20th century values of personal fulfillment than with 19th century dynastic duty, in hindsight. Her life reads less like eccentric deviation and more like early adoption of modern identity norms. Meanwhile, Biltmore's continued success reinforced a paradox. The estate survived not because it resisted change, but because it embraced it. It opened its gates. It monetized heritage. It turned private opulence into shared cultural experience. The very structure built to symbolize exclusivity became accessible. And perhaps this is where Cornelia's story intersects most powerfully with America's broader evolution. The country that once celebrated industrial titans began scrutinizing them. The nation that admired aristocratic mimicry shifted toward valuing individual authenticity. Cornelia's life quietly anticipated that shift. She did not mount ideological campaigns. She did not publish manifestos. She did not attempt to redefine Vanderbilt publicly. She simply lived differently, and living differently, when one carries a famous surname, becomes a form of commentary. In the American imagination today, Biltmore stands as both monument and museum. Visitors photograph its facade against the Carolina sky. They admire the craftsmanship. They purchase wine from the estate's vineyards. They leave with curated impressions of Gilded Age grandeur. Few pause to reflect on the heiress who declined to anchor herself permanently within that facade. Yet her story complicates the myth in productive ways. It reminds us that even within immense privilege, individuals grapple with identity. It reminds us that inheritance does not silence the need for autonomy. It reminds us that dynasties are not monoliths. They contain fracture lines, departures, redefinitions. Cornelia Vanderbilt's life adds texture to the Vanderbilt legend. Without her, the narrative would read as seamless continuity, industrial wealth translated into architectural permanence, preserved by dutiful heirs. With her, the narrative gains dimension. It includes tension. It includes movement. It includes choice. And choice is what transforms history from monument into story. As the 21st century continues to interrogate wealth inequality, inherited privilege, and cultural legacy, figures like Cornelia feel increasingly relevant because she embodies a tension still alive today. How does one honor origin without being consumed by it? How does one inherit without surrendering authorship? Her answer was not dramatic. It was steady. Step away, redefine, allow legacy to evolve without you. Biltmore stands. The Vanderbilt name endures, and Cornelia's decision continues to echo quietly within the American imagination. Not as scandal, but as possibility. The Vanderbilt story, like most dynastic narratives of the 19th century, was written around men, railroad consolidation, steamship monopolies, industrial expansion. Names like Cornelius Vanderbilt dominated headlines. Wealth was quantified in miles of track, tonnage of freight, stock valuations. Women appeared in the margins. Hostesses, patrons, symbols of refinement. When George Washington Vanderbilt II built Biltmore Estate, the architectural achievement overshadowed the domestic reality it would impose. The estate required a hostess. It required lineage continuity. It required an heir. That heir was Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt. From childhood, her role was implied, not demanded explicitly, but embedded in expectation. She would preserve the house. She would represent the name. She would embody cultivated restraint. This was not unique to the Vanderbilts. Across elite American and European families, daughters were raised as stabilizers of prestige. Their marriages were diplomatic bridges. Their comportment reinforced family mythology. Departure was rarely part of the script. Yet the 20th century destabilized that script. World wars shattered assumptions of permanence. Women entered public life in new ways. Divorce rates increased. Social hierarchies loosened. Within this context, Cornelia's decision to divorce John Francis Amherst Cecil in 1934 becomes more than a personal rupture. It becomes emblematic of a broader generational shift. She was not the first woman to divorce, but she was a Vanderbilt heiress, and that amplified the symbolic impact. Elite women of her era often endured marriages that prioritized status over fulfillment. Social discretion concealed dissatisfaction. Public separation risked reputational damage. Cornelia accepted that risk. And after divorce, she did something even more transgressive for her social class. She did not attempt immediate reputational repair through an equally strategic remarriage. Her later marriage to Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson lacked aristocratic theatrics. It reflected partnership rather than alliance. Her final marriage to William Goodsir in her 70s defied both age expectations and dynastic optics. These choices illustrate a pattern. She was not abandoning family out of impulsive rebellion. She was recalibrating identity away from institutional duty toward personal coherence. And this recalibration mirrors the quiet revolution many women experienced mid-century, particularly those born into rigid social frameworks. For women of immense privilege, autonomy can be paradoxically constrained. Wealth amplifies scrutiny. Visibility magnifies deviation. Cornelia's withdrawal from Biltmore reduced scrutiny. In England, she was not the American heiress in residence at a 250-room mansion. She was simply Cornelia, sometimes unconventional, sometimes restless, but no longer obligated to curate grandeur. The feminist lens applied retroactively to her life does not require her to have articulated ideology. She did not publicly campaign for women's liberation. She did not publish essays on autonomy, but lived experience can precede articulation. By stepping outside prescribed expectations, she embodied a shift that would later be named and theorized. And perhaps this is why her story resonates differently now than it did during her lifetime. In the 1930s and 1940s, her departure from Biltmore may have seemed eccentric or irresponsible. In the 21st century, it appears complex, even courageous. She was born into a role that most would consider enviable. She recognized that envy does not guarantee fulfillment. She left. That action challenges a persistent myth that privilege eliminates constraint. In reality, privilege can create a gilded boundary, luxurious, but restrictive. Cornelia crossed that boundary without burning it behind her. Her sons maintained the estate. The Vanderbilt name persisted. The structure endured, but she did not remain confined within it. The women of earlier Vanderbilt generations had reinforced the facade. They had hosted, curated, endured. Cornelia diverged, and divergence, especially from women in dynasties, alters narrative trajectory. It introduces multiplicity. The Vanderbilt story is no longer solely about industrial ascent and architectural spectacle. It includes introspection. It includes emotional negotiation. It includes a woman who chose self-definition over ceremonial permanence. This matters because dynasties shape cultural imagination. When a prominent heiress quietly redefines her role, it ripples outward. It suggests that even within the most rigid frameworks, alternatives exist. Cornelia Vanderbilt did not dismantle patriarchy. She did not dismantle capitalism. She did not dismantle Biltmore. But she dismantled the inevitability of her assigned script. And in doing so, she expanded the narrative space available to women who followed, not only in elite circles, but symbolically across social strata. History often spotlights grand gestures, yet sometimes the most consequential act is departure. Not loud, not incendiary, simply definitive. Cornelia's life reminds us that leaving can be as historically significant as building, and for women who were never meant to leave, that act reshapes the story forever. By the time the 20th century entered its final decades, the word Vanderbilt no longer carried the unchecked awe it once commanded. It carried history. It carried architecture. It carried cautionary tales about excess and decline. And at the center of its most enduring symbol, Biltmore Estate, stood a paradox. The house had been built to project permanence, yet permanence in America rarely belongs to families. It belongs to institutions. The transformation of Biltmore from private residence to public landmark was not inevitable. Many Gilded Age estates were demolished, subdivided, or surrendered to financial strain. Biltmore survived because it evolved, and in evolving, it subtly detached itself from singular ownership. Visitors no longer walk its halls as guests of a Vanderbilt. They walk as participants in curated history. They buy tickets. They follow guided tours. They consume narrative. The estate belongs, in a sense, to the public imagination. This shift reframes legacy. Legacy without possession. And that phrase describes Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt with uncanny precision. She inherited the most visible symbol of Vanderbilt ambition, the creation of George Washington Vanderbilt II, heir to Cornelius Vanderbilt's industrial empire. Yet she did not cling to possession. After divorcing John Francis Amherst Cecil, she relinquished her physical connection to Biltmore. She did not attempt to control its long-term trajectory. She did not position herself as permanent guardian. Her sons assumed responsibility. The estate's survival was secured not through her dominance, but through generational transition. This is an inversion of the typical dynastic arc, often. Heirs who withdraw are framed as negligent or disloyal. Cornelia's case complicates that framing, because her withdrawal did not destabilize the institution. It clarified roles. Her sons became stewards in their own right. They professionalized management. They adapted to economic realities. They made pragmatic decisions unencumbered by the emotional gravity that might have anchored their mother to the house. In stepping aside, she may have enabled sustainability. This does not imply strategic foresight. It suggests something subtler. Detachment can create space for evolution. Her life in England, marked by marriages to Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson and later William Goodser, unfolded far from North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains. She was no longer the axis around which Biltmore rotated, and yet her name remained permanently etched into its origin story. That is legacy without possession. She did not need to inhabit the house to remain part of its narrative. Modern conversations about wealth often center on accumulation and control. Estates are measured in assets. Families debate succession strategies. Legal frameworks protect ownership. Cornelia's life introduces an alternative model. Influence without constant proximity. Inheritance without lifelong confinement. Belonging without occupation. Her final choice, cremation rather than burial within the Vanderbilt mausoleum, extended this pattern. She declined even posthumous reintegration into the family monument. Her ashes, resting abroad, reinforced that her life trajectory diverged permanently from the stone lineage of the Vanderbilts. And yet, Biltmore stands. Visitors continue to trace her childhood through preserved rooms and archival photographs. Historians contextualize her within Gilded Age decline and 20th century transformation. She remains present, not through ownership, but through story. This distinction matters in a culture increasingly preoccupied with identity and autonomy. Many inherit roles they did not choose. Many feel tethered to expectations embedded before their birth. Cornelia's life does not provide a universal blueprint. Most people do not inherit mansions, but many inherit narratives, and she demonstrates that narratives can be reinterpreted without being destroyed. She did not erase Biltmore. She simply refused to let it define her entirely. In that refusal lies her quiet radicalism. Because dynasties depend on continuity, and continuity often depends on compliance. She offered continuity through lineage. Her sons remained, but she withheld compliance in her own life design. The result is a more complex Vanderbilt story. Not a clean arc of uninterrupted grandeur, not a tragic collapse of excess, but a layered narrative containing ambition, adaptation, divergence, and endurance, legacy without possession. It is a delicate balance. Too much detachment, and heritage dissolves. Too much possession, and identity calcifies. Cornelia occupied the middle ground. She walked away physically. She remained historically. She relinquished control. She retained authorship. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate long after headlines faded. Because in a world obsessed with holding on, she proved that letting go can be equally powerful. Stand at the front of Biltmore Estate on a clear morning, and the illusion still works. The limestone facade rises against the Blue Ridge Mountains with unwavering confidence. The symmetry suggests order. The gardens suggest permanence. The scale suggests that whoever built this believed deeply in endurance. That belief belonged to George Washington Vanderbilt II, scholar, collector, heir to the industrial empire forged by Cornelius Vanderbilt. Biltmore was not merely a residence. It was a declaration. It announced that American wealth could rival European aristocracy, not only in fortune, but in cultural sophistication. Libraries lined with rare volumes, art sourced from across continents, landscapes engineered into pastoral perfection. It was ambition carved into stone, and into that monument. In 1900 was born Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, the only child of George and Edith Vanderbilt. From the beginning, her identity intertwined with architecture. She did not grow up in an ordinary nursery. She grew up in a house so vast that it required maps for guests. Servants moved discreetly through hidden corridors. Formal dinners unfolded beneath chandeliers designed to impress visiting dignitaries. Her childhood unfolded inside a myth in progress. But myths rarely reveal their internal pressures. The Vanderbilt narrative, especially as projected through Biltmore, suggested cultivated stability, yet beneath the elegance existed vulnerability. George Vanderbilt died unexpectedly in 1914 when Cornelia was just 13. His death shifted Biltmore's emotional foundation. The estate remained magnificent, but its guiding presence vanished. The Great War reshaped global politics. The old European aristocracies that had inspired Biltmore's aesthetic faced collapse. The very model George admired was destabilizing, and young Cornelia inherited not only property, but expectation. As the sole heir, she symbolized continuity. Visitors saw lineage secured. Newspapers saw romantic inheritance. Society saw a future hostess prepared to carry forward the Vanderbilt prestige. But expectation is not the same as desire. When she married John Francis Amherst Cecil in 1924, the union seemed to harmonize American fortune with British tradition. It satisfied aesthetic symmetry, Vanderbilt wealth aligning with aristocratic refinement. The wedding itself reinforced the myth. It suggested that Biltmore would remain anchored within transatlantic elegance for a time. The illusion held. The Cecils resided at Biltmore. Their sons were born within its orbit. Social life continued, though the Gilded Age glow had dimmed into something more restrained. But outside the estate's gates, America was changing. The Roaring Twenties celebrated modernity over inheritance. The Great Depression challenged the morality of immense private wealth. Industrial titans no longer commanded uncritical admiration. Biltmore, built to symbolize triumph, risked appearing excessive within the shifting cultural landscape. Cornelia's internal dissonance intensified. To remain permanently at Biltmore required more than affection for architecture. It required embracing the role of dynastic steward, public figure, cultural symbol, guardian of inherited grandeur. She began to question that alignment. Her 1934 divorce from John Cecil fractured the myth, not because divorce was unprecedented, but because it disrupted the seamless narrative Biltmore represented. The house symbolized continuity. Divorce signaled rupture. Soon after, she left North Carolina. That departure altered the symbolic equilibrium. For the first time, Biltmore existed without its heiress at the center. The mansion remained imposing. The gardens remained immaculate, but the narrative shifted from lived grandeur to curated memory. This is where myth and reality diverge. Myth suggests that monuments anchor identity permanently. Reality suggests that identity can detach. Cornelia's life after departure did not dismantle Biltmore's myth entirely. Instead, it reframed it. The estate became less about living dynasty and more about historical artifact. Its survival required adaptation, opening to the public, diversifying revenue, embracing tourism. In stepping away, Cornelia inadvertently accelerated Biltmore's transformation from private symbol to public institution. The mansion persisted, the myth evolved, and Cornelia herself moved from central character to enigmatic figure, part of the origin story, yet no longer bound by it. Today, millions walk through Biltmore each year. They admire ceilings and tapestries. They photograph balconies and fireplaces. They hear narratives of Vanderbilt ambition and architectural brilliance. Few fully confront the tension embedded in its history. The only child born to inherit it chose not to remain. That decision does not diminish the mansion. It humanizes it. Because behind every monument lies a person who must decide whether to belong to it. Cornelia Vanderbilt stood at the intersection of stone and self. and she chose self. The mansion endures as testament to ambition. Her life endures as testament to autonomy. Together, they form a story more layered than myth alone could ever sustain. History prefers clean conclusions. A dynasty rises. It builds monuments. Its heirs preserve them. The story closes in symmetry, but the life of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt resists symmetry. Because she did not return for a final tableau beneath the stone arches of Biltmore Estate, she did not reclaim ceremonial authority. She did not anchor herself to the mausoleum of Cornelius Vanderbilt's descendants. She refused the expected ending. By the 1970s, Biltmore had already transitioned decisively into public heritage. Its preservation relied not on nostalgia, but on economic pragmatism. Her sons had assumed stewardship. The estate functioned as enterprise as much as monument. Across the Atlantic, Cornelia's life had narrowed into privacy. After the death of Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson, and later marriage to William Goodsir, she no longer existed within public spectacle. There were no grand interviews revisiting her youth, no dramatic reconciliations staged for press consumption. The heiress who once symbolized continuity had become a woman uninterested in spectacle, and this is where her story unsettles the conventional arc. Because America, especially in the 20th century, developed a fascination with redemption narratives, public figures fall, wander, then return. They reconcile with origin. They stand again in the place where their story began. Cornelia did not. Her refusal to return for her mother's funeral decades earlier had already signaled emotional distance. But in death, she could have re-entered the Vanderbilt monument through burial. She chose cremation. Cremation severs architectural permanence. It resists enclosure within mausoleums and carved stone. It is the final gesture of non-possession. The Vanderbilt Mausoleum in Staten Island remains filled with generations who embraced lineage in death as in life. Cornelia's absence from it is quiet, but definitive. She was not rejecting ancestry. She was declining absorption. This distinction matters throughout her life. She did not wage war against Biltmore or the Vanderbilt name. She did not publish grievances. She did not attempt to dismantle her inheritance publicly. She simply opted not to conclude her story where it began, and in doing so, she reframed legacy. Legacy, in her case, became something carried internally rather than displayed architecturally. Meanwhile, Biltmore continues to thrive. Visitors walk corridors built by George Washington Vanderbilt II, absorbing curated narratives of Gilded Age ambition. The estate stands not as relic, but as functioning institution. Its endurance proves that continuity does not require uniform participation from every heir. Cornelia's life, viewed from distance, reads less like rebellion and more like boundary setting. She inherited magnitude. She accepted history, but she limited its jurisdiction over her personal choices. In the modern era, where conversations about identity, autonomy, and generational expectation intensify, her life feels unexpectedly contemporary. Many inherit frameworks they did not construct: family businesses, cultural traditions, reputational burdens. Some remain within them. Some attempt reform from inside. Some leave. Cornelia left without collapse. She allowed Biltmore to evolve without her constant presence. She allowed her sons to define stewardship on their own terms. She permitted the Vanderbilt name to persist, but not to dictate her final chapter. There is restraint in that choice, not dramatic rupture, not theatrical estrangement, simply firm separation. The heiress who could have ended her story framed by stone instead chose dispersion, ashes rather than mausoleum, privacy rather than monument. And perhaps that is the truest ending available to someone born inside the largest private home in America. Not a triumphant return, not a tragic fall, but a deliberate refusal to let architecture decide destiny. Biltmore remains. The Vanderbilt legend endures. And Cornelia Vanderbilt's life closes not with spectacle, but with authorship. She inherited a house built to last forever. She proved that a person does not have to download as audio tiep theo kung, soon saung in ki tu, hoi mui, fan ba, what endures in the end. The question is not whether Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt loved Biltmore Estate. It is whether love alone is enough to anchor a life. Biltmore still rises from the Blue Ridge landscape with architectural certainty. Built by George Washington Vanderbilt II, heir to Cornelius Vanderbilt's industrial fortune. It was designed to communicate endurance, cultural, financial, familial. Stone implies permanence, but permanence is an illusion humans construct to calm themselves against time. Cornelia's life complicates that illusion. She was born inside permanence. She inherited scale. She inherited expectation, and she stepped beyond it. Not because the house lacked beauty, not because the Vanderbilt name lacked power, but because neither answered the deeper question of identity. When she divorced John Francis Amherst Cecil, when she crossed the Atlantic, when she remarried outside the rigid choreography of dynastic advantage, first to Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson and later to William Goodsir, she was not dismantling heritage. She was refining authorship. History often evaluates heirs through metrics of preservation. Did they protect assets? Did they extend influence? Did they avoid scandal? By those measures, Cornelia appears ambiguous. She did not remain to preside over Biltmore as matriarch. She did not enshrine herself within the Vanderbilt mausoleum. She did not craft memoirs to shape interpretation, and yet, nothing collapsed. Biltmore survived. The Vanderbilt name persists. The estate thrives as public institution. What endures? Then, the house endures as structure. The dynasty endures as narrative. But Cornelia endures as tension. Her life introduces friction into the smooth arc of American wealth mythology. It asks whether inheritance obligates permanence. It asks whether belonging requires confinement. For visitors walking through Biltmore today, the experience is immersive. They see banquet halls, tapestries, libraries curated by George's intellectual ambition. They hear stories of Gilded Age splendor. They may not dwell long on the fact that the sole child born to inherit it chose not to remain within its walls. But that choice hums beneath the narrative. Because Biltmore is not only a monument to ambition, it is a monument to divergence. It stands precisely because it adapted. It opened its gates. It monetized history. It shifted from private opulence to shared experience in a quiet way. Cornelia's departure parallels that evolution. She moved from prescribed role to self-directed life, from inherited script to personal authorship. Both the mansion and the heiress transformed, differently, but decisively. Her cremation sealed that transformation. Stone markers anchor bodies to geography. Cremation releases geography from final authority. She did not return to North Carolina in death. She did not rejoin the monumental symmetry. Her ashes, resting in the United Kingdom, complete the arc she began decades earlier. And yet, she remains inseparable from Biltmore's story. Because origin cannot be erased, it can be reinterpreted. Cornelia Vanderbilt's legacy is not built from architecture. It is built from refusal. Refusal to let expectation define destiny. Refusal to let wealth silence individuality. Refusal to conclude her life where it began simply because symmetry would look pleasing in retrospect. What endures, ultimately, is not the stone. It is the possibility her life suggests, that even within immense privilege, choice remains, that even within monuments, Movement is possible. That legacy does not require captivity. Biltmore will continue standing long after every living descendant fades. Tourists will keep photographing its facade. Historians will continue analyzing the Gilded Age. The Vanderbilt name will cycle through admiration and critique, and somewhere within that enduring structure exists the echo of a woman who walked away. Not in anger, not in scandal, but in quiet assertion. She inherited the largest private home in America. She proved that the largest inheritance of all is authorship over one's own life, and that far more than stone is what truly endures.